Book 4, Part 1 of the Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. The Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus, translated by Alfred John Church and William Jackson Brodrib. Book 4, AD 23 to 28, Part 1. The Rise of Sejanus. The year when Caius Asinius and Caius Antistius were consuls was the 9th of Tiberius's reign, a period of tranquillity for the state and prosperity for his own house, for he counted Germanicus's death a happy incident. Suddenly fortune deranged everything. The emperor became a cruel tyrant, as well as an abettor of cruelty in others. Of this the cause and origin was Aelius Sejanus, commander of the praetorian cohorts, of whose influence I have already spoken. I will now fully describe his extraction, his character, and the daring wickedness by which he grasped at power. Born at Volsinii, the son of Seius Strabo, a Roman knight, he attached himself in his early youth to Caius Caesar, grandson of the divine Augustus, and the story went that he had sold his person to Apicius, a rich debauchee. Soon afterwards he won the heart of Tiberius so effectually by various artifices, that the emperor, ever dark and mysterious towards others, was with Sejanus alone careless and free-spoken. It was not through his craft, for it was by this very weapon that he was overthrown. It was rather from heaven's wrath against Rome, to whose welfare his elevation and his fall were alike disastrous. He had a body which could endure hardships, and a daring spirit. He was one who screened himself while he was attacking others. He was as cringing as he was imperious. Before the world he affected humility. In his heart he lusted after supremacy, for the sake of which he was sometimes lavish and luxurious, but oftener energetic and watchful, qualities quite as mischievous when hypocritically assumed for the attainment of sovereignty. He strengthened the hitherto moderate powers of his office by concentrating the cohorts scattered throughout the capital into one camp, so that they might all receive orders at the same moment, and that the sight of their numbers and strength might give confidence to themselves, while it would strike terror into the citizens. His pretexts were the demoralization incident to a dispersed soldiery, the greater effectiveness of simultaneous action in the event of a sudden peril, and the stricter discipline which would be ensured by the establishment of an encampment at a distance from the temptations of the city. As soon as the camp was completed, he crept gradually into the affections of the soldiers, by mixing with them and addressing them by name, himself selecting the centurions and tribunes. With the Senate, too, he sought to ingratiate himself, distinguishing his partisans with offices and provinces, Tiberius readily yielding, and being so biased that not only in private conversation, but before the senators and the people, he spoke highly of him as the partner of his toils, and allowed his statutes to be honoured in theatres, in forums, and at the headquarters of our legions. There were, however, obstacles to his ambition in the imperial house with its many princes, a son in youthful manhood, and grown-up grandsons. As it would be unsafe to sweep off such a number at once by violence, while craft would necessitate successive intervals in crime, he chose on the whole the stealthier way, and to begin with Drusus, against whom he had the stimulus of a recent resentment. Drusus, who could not brook a rival, and was somewhat irascible, had in a casual dispute raised his fist at Sejanus, and when he defended himself had struck him in the face. On considering every plan, Sejanus thought his easiest revenge was to turn his attention to Livia, Drusus's wife. She was a sister of Germanicus, and though she was not handsome as a girl, she became a woman of surpassing beauty. Pretending an ardent passion for her, he seduced her, and having won his first infamous triumph, and assured that a woman after having parted with her virtue will hesitate at nothing, he lured her on to thoughts of marriage, of a share in sovereignty, and of her husband's destruction. And she, the niece of Augustus, the daughter-in-law of Tiberius, the mother of children by Drusus, for a provincial paramour foully disgraced herself, her ancestors, and her descendants, giving up honour and a sure position for prospects as base as they were uncertain. They took into their confidence Eudemus, Livia's friend and physician, whose profession was a pretext for frequent secret interviews. Sejanus, to avert his mistress's jealousy, divorced his wife Apicata, by whom he had had 3 children. Still the magnitude of the crime caused fear and delay, and sometimes a conflict of plans. Meanwhile, at the beginning of this year, Drusus, one of the children of Germanicus, assumed the dress of manhood, with a repetition of the honours decreed by the Senate to his brother Nero. The emperor added a speech with warm praise of his son for sharing a father's affection to his brother's children. Drusus, indeed, difficult as it is for power and mutual harmony to exist side by side, had the character of being kindly disposed, or at least not unfriendly, towards the lads. And now the old plan, so often insincerely broached, of a progress through the provinces was again discussed. The emperor's pretext was the number of veterans on the eve of discharge, and the necessity of fresh levies for the army. Volunteers were not forthcoming, and even if they were sufficiently numerous, they had not the same bravery and discipline, as it is chiefly the needy and the homeless who adopt by their own choice a soldier's life. Tiberius also rapidly enumerated the legions and the provinces which they had to garrison. I too ought, I think, to go through these details, and thus show what forces Rome then had under arms, what kings were our allies, and how much narrower then were the limits of our empire. Italy on both seas was guarded by fleets, at Misenum and at Ravenna, and the contiguous coast of Gaul by ships of war captured in the victory of Actium, and sent by Augustus powerfully manned to the town of Foro Julium. But chief strength was on the Rhine, as a defence alike against Germans and Gauls, and numbered 8 legions. Spain, lately subjugated, was held by 3. Mauritania was King Juba's, who had received it as a gift from the Roman people. The rest of Africa was garrisoned by 2 legions, and Egypt by the same number. Next, beginning with Syria, all within the entire tract of country stretching as far as the Euphrates was kept in restraint by 4 legions, and on this frontier were Iberian, Albanian, and other kings, to whom our greatness was a protection against any foreign power. Thrace was held by Rhemotalces and the children of Cotys, the bank of the Danube by 2 legions in Pannonia, 2 in Mysia, and 2 also were stationed in Dalmatia, which, from the situation of the country, were in the rear of the other 4, and, should Italy suddenly require aid, not too distant to be summoned. But the capital was garrisoned by its own special soldiery, 3 city, 9 praetorian cohorts, levied for the most part in Etruria and Umbria, or ancient Latium and the old Roman colonies. There were besides, in commanding positions in the provinces, allied fleets, cavalry, and light infantry, of but little inferior strength. But any detailed account of them would be misleading, since they moved from place to place as circumstances required, and had their numbers increased and sometimes diminished. It is, however, I think, a convenient opportunity for me to review the hitherto prevailing methods of administration in the other departments of the state, inasmuch as that year brought with it the beginning of a change for the worse in Tiberius's policy. In the first place, public business and the most important private matters were managed by the Senate. The leading men were allowed freedom of discussion, and when they stooped to flattery, the emperor himself checked them. He bestowed honours with regard to noble ancestry, military renown, or brilliant accomplishments as a civilian, letting it be clearly seen that there were no better men to choose. The consul and the praetor retained their prestige, inferior magistrates exercised their authority, the laws too, with the single exception of cases of treason, were properly enforced. As to the duties on corn, the indirect taxes, and other branches of the public revenue, they were in the hands of companies of Roman knights. The emperor entrusted his own property to men of the most tried integrity, or to persons known only by their general reputation, and once appointed they were retained without any limitation, so that most of them grew old in the same employments. The city populace indeed suffered much from high prices, but this was no fault of the emperor, who actually endeavoured to counteract barren soils and stormy seas with every resource of wealth and foresight. And he was also careful not to distress the provinces by new burdens, and to see that in bearing the old they were safe from any rapacity or oppression on the part of governors. Corporal punishments and confiscations of property were unknown. The emperor had only a few estates in Italy, slaves on a moderate scale, and his household was confined to a few freedmen. If ever he had a dispute with a private person, it was decided in the law courts. All this, not indeed with any graciousness, but in a blunt fashion which often alarmed, he still kept up, until the death of Drusus changed everything. While he lived, the system continued, because Sejanus, as yet only in the beginning of his power, wished to be known as an upright counsellor, and there was one whose vengeance he dreaded, who did not conceal his hatred, and incessantly complained that a stranger was invited to assist in the government while the emperor's son was alive. How near was the step of declaring the stranger a colleague! Ambition at first had a steep path before it. When once the way had been entered, zealous adherents were forthcoming. Already, at the pleasure of the commander of the guards, a camp had been established, the soldiers given into his hands. His statues were to be seen among the monuments of Cnaeus Pompeius. His grandsons would be of the same blood as the family of the Drusi. Henceforth they must pray that he might have self-control, and so be contented. So would Drusus talk not unfrequently, or only in the hearing of a few persons. Even his confidences, now that his wife had been corrupted, were betrayed. Sejanus accordingly thought that he must be prompt, and chose a poison the gradual working of which might be mistaken for a natural disorder. It was given to Drusus by Lygdus, a eunuch, as was ascertained 8 years later. As for Tiberius, he went to the Senate house during the whole time of the prince's illness, either because he was not afraid, or to show his strength of mind, and even in the interval between his death and funeral. Seeing the consuls in token of their grief sitting on the ordinary benches, he reminded them of their high office and of their proper place, and when the Senate burst into tears, suppressing a groan, he revived their spirits with a fluent speech. He knew, indeed, that he might be reproached for thus encountering the gaze of the Senate after so recent an affliction. Most mourners could hardly bear even the soothing words of kinsfolk, or to look on the light of day, and such were not to be condemned as weak. But he had sought a more manly consolation in the bosom of the Commonwealth. Then, deploring the extreme age of Augusta, the childhood of his grandsons, and his own declining years, he begged the Senate to summon Germanicus's children, the only comfort under their present misery. The consuls went out, and having encouraged the young princes with kind words, brought them in and presented them to the emperor. Taking them by the hand, he said, "Senators, when these boys lost their father, I committed them to their uncle, and begged him, though he had children of his own, to cherish and rear them as his own offspring, and train them for himself and for posterity. Drusus is now lost to us, and I turn my prayers to you, and before heaven and your country I adjure you to receive into your care and guidance the great-grandsons of Augustus, descendants of a most noble ancestry. So fulfill your duty and mine. To you, Nero and Drusus, these senators are as fathers. Such is your birth, that your prosperity and adversity must alike affect the state." There was great weeping at these words, and then many a benediction. Had the emperor set bounds to his speech, he must have filled the hearts of his hearers with sympathy and admiration. But he now fell back on those idle and often ridiculed professions about restoring the Republic, and the wish that the consuls or someone else might undertake the government, and thus destroyed belief even in what was genuine and noble. The same honours were decreed to the memory of Drusus as to that of Germanicus, and many more were added. Such is the way with flattery when repeated. The funeral with its procession of statues was singularly grand. Aeneas, the father of the Julian house, all the Alban kings, Romulus, Rome's founder, then the Sabine nobility, Attus Clausus, and the busts of all the other Claudii were displayed in a long train. In relating the death of Drusus I have followed the narrative of most of the best historians. But I would not pass over a rumour of the time, the strength of which is not even yet exhausted. Sejanus, it is said, having seduced Livia into crime, next secured by the foulest means the consent of Lygdus the eunuch, as from his youth and beauty he was his master's favourite and one of his principal attendants. When those who were in the secret had decided on the time and place of the poisoning, Sejanus, with the most consummate daring, reversed his plan, and whispering an accusation against Drusus of intending to poison his father, warned Tiberius to avoid the first draught offered him as he was dining at his son's house. Thus deceived, the old emperor, on sitting down to the banquet, took the cup and handed it to Drusus. His suspicions were increased when Drusus, in perfect unconsciousness, drank it off with youthful eagerness, apparently out of fear and shame, bringing on himself the death which he had plotted against his father. These popular rumours, over and above the fact that they are not vouched for by any good writer, may be instantly refuted. For who, with moderate prudence, far less Tiberius with his great experience, would have thrust destruction on a son, without even hearing him, with his own hand too, and with an impossibility of returning to better thoughts? Surely he would rather have had the slave who handed the poison tortured, have sought to discover the traitor, in short, would have been as hesitating and tardy in the case of an only son hitherto unconvicted of any crime, as he was naturally even with strangers. But as Sejanus had the credit of contriving every sort of wickedness, the fact that he was the emperor's special favourite, and that both were hated by the rest of the world, procured belief for any monstrous fiction, and rumour too always has a dreadful side in regard to the deaths of men in power. Besides, the whole process of the crime was betrayed by Apicata, Sejanus's wife, and fully divulged, under torture, by Eudemus and Lygdus. No writer has been found sufficiently malignant to fix the guilt on Tiberius, though every circumstance was scrutinized and exaggerated. My object in mentioning and refuting this story is, by a conspicuous example, to put down hearsay, and to request all into whose hands my work shall come, not to catch eagerly at wild and improbable rumours in preference to genuine history which has not been perverted into romance. Tiberius pronounced a panegyric on his son before the rostra, during which the Senate and people, in appearance rather than in heart, put on the expression and accents of sorrow, while they inwardly rejoiced at the brightening future of the family of Germanicus. This beginning of popularity, and the ill-concealed ambition of their mother Agrippina, hastened its downfall. Sejanus, when he saw that the death of Drusus was not avenged on the murderers, and was no grief to the people, grew bold in wickedness, and, now that his first attempt had succeeded, speculated on the possibility of destroying the children of Germanicus, whose succession to the throne was a certainty. There were 3, and poison could not be distributed among them because of the singular fidelity of their guardians and the unassailable virtue of Agrippina. So Sejanus inveighed against Agrippina's arrogance, and worked powerfully on Augusta's old hatred of her, and on Livia's consciousness of recent guilt, and urged both these women to represent to the emperor that her pride as a mother and her reliance on popular enthusiasm were leading her to dream of empire. Livia availed herself of the cunning of accusers, among whom she had selected Julius Postumus, a man well suited to her purpose, as he had an intrigue with Mutilia Prisca, and was consequently in the confidence of Augusta, over whose mind Prisca had great influence. She thus made her aged grandmother, whose nature it was to tremble for her power, irreconcilably hostile to her grandson's widow. Agrippina's friends, too, were induced to be always inciting her proud spirit by mischievous talk. Tiberius, meanwhile, who did not relax his attention to business, and found solace in his work, occupied himself with the causes of citizens at Rome, and with petitions from allies. Decrees of the Senate were passed at his proposal for relieving the cities of Sybaira and Aegium in Asia and Achaea, which had suffered from earthquakes, by a remission of 3 years' tribute. Vivius Serenus, too, proconsul of Further Spain, was condemned for violence in his official capacity, and was banished to the island of Amorgus for his savage temper. Carcidius Sacerdos, accused of having helped our enemy Tacfarinas with supplies of grain, was acquitted, as was also Caius Gracchus on the same charge. Gracchus's father, Sempronius, had taken him when a mere child to the island of Cercina to be his companion in exile. There he grew up among outcasts who knew nothing of a liberal education, and after a while supported himself in Africa and Sicily by petty trade. But he did not escape the dangers of high rank. Had not his innocence been protected by Aelius Lamia and Lucius Apronius, successive governors of Africa, the splendid fame of that ill-starred family and the downfall of his father would have dragged him to ruin. This year, too, brought embassies from the Greek communities. The people of Samos and Kos petitioned for the confirmation of the ancient rite of sanctuary for the respective temples of Juno and Aesculapius. The Samians relied on a decree of the Amphictyonic Council, which had the supreme decision of all questions when the Greeks, through the cities they had founded in Asia, had possession of the sea-coast. Kos could boast equal antiquity, and it had an additional claim connected with the place. Roman citizens had been admitted to the temple of Aesculapius, when King Mithridates ordered a general massacre of them throughout all the islands and cities of Asia. Next, after various and usually fruitless complaints from the praetors, the emperor finally brought forward a motion about the licentious behaviour of the players. They had often, he said, sought to disturb the public peace, and to bring disgrace on private families, and the old Oscan farce, once a wretched amusement for the vulgar, had become at once so indecent and so popular that it must be checked by the Senate's authority. The players, upon this, were banished from Italy. That same year also brought fresh sorrow to the emperor, by being fatal to one of the twin sons of Drusus, equally too by the death of an intimate friend. This was Lucilius Longus, the partner of all his griefs and joys, the only senator who had been the companion of his retirement in Rhodes. And so, though he was a man of humble origin, the Senate decreed him a censor's funeral, and a statue in the Forum of Augustus at the public expense. Everything indeed was as yet in the hands of the Senate, and consequently Lucilius Capito, procurator of Asia, who was impeached by his province, was tried by them, the emperor vehemently asserting that he had merely given the man authority over the slaves and property of the imperial establishments, that if he had taken upon himself the powers of a praetor and used military force, he had disregarded his instructions, therefore they must hear the provincials. So the case was heard, and the accused condemned. The cities of Asia, gratified by this retribution, and the punishment inflicted in the previous year on Caius Silanus, voted a temple to Tiberius, his mother, and the Senate, and were permitted to build it. Nero thanked the senators and his grandfather on their behalf, and carried with him the joyful sympathies of his audience, who, with the memory of Germanicus fresh in their minds, imagined that it was his face they saw, his voice they heard. The youth, too, had a modesty and a grace of person worthy of a prince, the more charming because of his peril from the notorious enmity of Sejanus. About the same time the emperor spoke on the subject of electing a priest of Jupiter in the room of Servius Meluginensis, deceased, and of the enactment of a new law. It was, he said, the old custom to nominate together 3 patricians, sons of parents wedded according to the primitive ceremony, and of these one was to be chosen. Now, however, there was not the same choice as formerly, the primitive form of marriage having been given up, or being observed only by a few persons. For this he assigned several reasons, the chief being men's and women's indifference. Then again the ceremony itself had its difficulties, which were purposely avoided, and there was the objection that the man who obtained this priesthood was emancipated from the father's authority, as also was his wife, as passing into the husband's control. So the Senate, Tiberius argued, ought to apply some remedy by a decree of a law, as Augustus had accommodated certain relics of a rude antiquity to the modern spirit. It was then decided, after a discussion of religious questions, that the institution of the priests of Jupiter should remain unchanged. A law, however, was passed that the priestess, in regard to her sacred functions, was to be under the husband's control, but in other respects to retain the ordinary legal position of women. Meluginensis, the son, was chosen successor to his father. To raise the dignity of the priesthood, and to inspire the priests with more zeal in attending to the ceremonial, a gift of 2,000,000 sesterces was decreed to the Vestal Cornelia, chosen in the room of Scantia, and whenever Augusta entered the theatre, she was to have a place in the seats of the Vestals. End of Book 4, Part 1. Recording by Graham Redman. Book 4, Part 2 of the Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. The Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus, translated by Alfred John Church and William Jackson Brodrib. Book 4, AD 23–28, Part 2, Sons of Germanicus resented by Tiberius. In the consulship of Cornelius Cethegus and Vesalius Varro, the pontiffs, whose example was followed by the other priests in offering prayers for the emperor's health, commended also Nero and Drusus to the same deities, not so much out of love for the young princes as out of sycophancy, the absence and excess of which in a corrupt age are alike dangerous. Tiberius, indeed, who was never friendly to the house of Germanicus, was then vexed beyond endurance at their youth being honoured equally with his declining years. He summoned the pontiffs, and asked them whether it was to the entreaties or the threats of Agrippina that they had made this concession. And though they gave a flat denial, he rebuked them, but gently, for many of them were her own relatives or were leading men in the state. However, he addressed a warning to the Senate against encouraging pride in their young and excitable minds by premature honours. For Sejanus spoke vehemently, and charged them with rending the state almost by civil war. There were those, he said, who called themselves the party of Agrippina, and unless they were checked, there would be more. The only remedy for the increasing discord was the overthrow of one or two of the most enterprising leaders. Accordingly, he attacked Caius Silius and Titius Sabinus. The friendship of Germanicus was fatal to both. As for Silius, his having commanded a great army for 7 years, and won in Germany the distinctions of a triumph for his success in the war with Sacrovir, would make his downfall all the more tremendous, and so spread greater terror among others. Many thought that he had provoked further displeasure by his own presumption and his extravagant boasts that his troops had been steadfastly loyal while other armies were falling into mutiny, and that Tiberius's throne could not have lasted had his legions too been bent on revolution. All this the emperor regarded as undermining his own power, which seemed to be unequal to the burden of such an obligation. For benefits received are a delight to us as long as we think we can requite them. When that possibility is far exceeded, they are repaid with hatred instead of gratitude. Silius had a wife, Sosia Galla, whose love of Agrippina made her hateful to the emperor. The two, it was decided, were to be attacked, but Sabinus was to be put off for a time. Varro the consul was let loose on them, who, under colour of a hereditary feud, humoured the malignity of Sejanus to his own disgrace. The accused begged a brief respite until the prosecutor's consulship expired, but the emperor opposed the request. It was usual, he argued, for magistrates to bring a private citizen to trial, and a consul's authority ought not to be impaired, seeing that it rested with his vigilance to guard the commonwealth from loss. It was characteristic of Tiberius to veil new devices in wickedness under ancient names. And so, with a solemn appeal, he summoned the Senate, as if there were any laws by which Silius was being tried, as if Varro were a real consul, or Rome a commonwealth. The accused either said nothing, or, if he attempted to defend himself, hinted, not obscurely, at the person whose resentment was crushing him. a long-concealed complicity in Sacrovira's rebellion, a rapacity which sullied his victory, and his wife Sosia's conduct were alleged against him. Unquestionably they could not extricate themselves from the charge of extortion. The whole affair, however, was conducted as a trial for treason, and Silius forestalled impending doom by a self-inflicted death. Yet there was a merciless confiscation of his property, though not to refund their money to the provincials, none of whom pressed any demand. But Augustus's bounty was wrested from him, and the claims of the imperial exchequer were computed in detail. This was the first instance on Tiberius's part of sharp dealing with the wealth of others. Sosia was banished on the motion of Asinius Gallus, who had proposed that half her estate should be confiscated, half left to the children. Marcus Lepidus, on the contrary, was for giving a fourth to the prosecutors, as the law required, and the remainder to the children. This Lepidus, I am satisfied, was for that age a wise and high-principled man. Many a cruel suggestion made by the flattery of others he changed for the better, and yet he did not want tact, seeing that he always enjoyed an uniform prestige, and also the favour of Tiberius. This compels me to doubt whether the liking of princes for some men, and their antipathy to others, depend, like other contingencies, on a fate and destiny to which we are born, or to some degree on our own plans, so that it is possible to pursue a course between a defiant independence and a debasing servility free from ambition and its perils. Messallinus Cotta, of equally illustrious ancestry as Lepidus, but wholly different in disposition, proposed that the Senate should pass a decree providing that even innocent governors who knew nothing of the delinquencies of others should be punished for their wives' offences in the provinces as much as for their own. Proceedings were then taken against Calpurnius Piso, a high-spirited nobleman. He it was, as I have related, who had exclaimed more than once in the Senate that he would quit Rome because of the combinations of the informers, and had dared, in defiance of Augustus' power, to sue Urgulania and summon her from the emperor's palace. Tiberius submitted to this at the time not ungraciously, but the remembrance of it was vividly impressed on a mind which brooded over its resentments, even though the first impulse of his displeasure had subsided. Quintus Granius accused Piso of secret treasonable conversation, and added that he kept poison in his house and wore a dagger whenever he came into the Senate. This was passed over as too atrocious to be true. He was to be tried on the other charges, a multitude of which were heaped on him, but his timely death cut short the trial. Next was taken the case of Cassius Severus, an exile, a man of mean origin and a life of crime, but a powerful pleader. He had brought on himself, by his persistent quarrelsomeness, a decision of the Senate under oath, which banished him to Crete. There, by the same practices, he drew on himself fresh odium, and revived the old. Stripped of his property and outlawed, he wore out his old age on the rock of Seriphus. About the same time, Plautius Silvanus, the praetor, for unknown reasons, threw his wife Apronia out of a window. When summoned before the emperor by Lucius Apronius, his father-in-law, he replied incoherently, representing that he was in a sound sleep, and consequently knew nothing, and that his wife had chosen to destroy herself. Without a moment's delay, Tiberius went to the house and inspected the chamber, where were seen the marks of her struggling and of her forcible ejection. He reported this to the Senate, and as soon as judges had been appointed, Urgulania, the grandmother of Silvanus, sent her grandson a dagger. This was thought equivalent to a hint from the emperor, because of the known intimacy between Augusta and Ergulania. The accused tried the steel in vain, and then allowed his veins to be opened. Shortly afterwards, Numantina, his former wife, was charged with having caused her husband's insanity by magical incantations and potions, but she was acquitted. This year at last released Rome from her long contest with the Numidian Tacferinus. Former generals, when they thought that their successes were enough to ensure them triumphal distinctions, left the enemy to himself. There were now in Rome 3 laurelled statues, and yet Tacferinus was still ravaging Africa, strengthened by reinforcements from the Moors, who, under the boyish and careless rule of Ptolemaeus, Juba's son, had chosen war in preference to the despotism of freedmen and slaves. He had the king of the Garamantes to receive his plunder, and to be the partner of his raids, not indeed with a regular army, but with detachments of light troops, whose strength, as they came from a distance, rumour exaggerated. From the province itself every needy and restless adventurer hurried to join him, for the emperor, as if not an enemy remained in Africa after the achievements of Blsesus, had ordered the 9th Legion home, and Publius Dolabella, proconsul that year, had not dared to retain it, because he feared the sovereign's orders more than the risks of war. Tacferinus accordingly spread rumours that elsewhere also nations were rending the empire of Rome, and that therefore her soldiers were gradually retiring from Africa, and that the rest might be cut off by a strong effort on the part of all who loved freedom more than slavery. He thus augmented his force, and having formed a camp, he besieged the town of Tubuscum. Dolabella, meanwhile, collecting all the troops on the spot, raised the siege at his first approach, by the terror of the Roman name, and because the Numidians cannot stand against the charge of infantry. He then fortified suitable positions, and at the same time beheaded some chiefs of the Musulamii, who were on the verge of rebellion. Next, as several expeditions against Tacferinus had proved the uselessness of following up the enemy's desultory movements with the attack of heavy troops from a single point, he summoned to his aid King Ptolemaeus and his people, and equipped 4 columns under the command of his lieutenants and tribunes. Marauding parties were also led by picked Moors, Dolabella in person directing every operation. Soon afterwards news came that the Numidians had fixed their tents and encamped near a half-demolished fortress by name Orzia, to which they had themselves formerly set fire, and on the position of which they relied, as it was enclosed by vast forests. Immediately the light infantry and cavalry, without knowing whither they were being led, were hurried along at quick march. Day dawned, and with the sound of trumpets and fierce shouts, they were on the half-asleep barbarians, whose horses were tethered or roaming over distant pastures. On the Roman side the infantry was in close array, the cavalry in its squadrons, everything prepared for an engagement, while the enemy, utterly surprised, without arms, order, or plan, were seized, slaughtered, or captured like cattle. The infuriated soldiers, remembering their hardships, and how often the longed-for conflict had been eluded, sated themselves to a man with vengeance and bloodshed. The word went through the companies that all were to aim at securing Tacferinus, whom, after so many battles, they knew well, as there would be no rest from war except by the destruction of the enemy's leader. Tacferinus, his guards slain round him, his son a prisoner, and the Romans bursting on him from every side, rushed on the darts, and by a death which was not unavenged, escaped captivity. This ended the war. Dolabella asked for triumphal distinctions, but was refused by Tiberius out of compliment to Sejanus, the glory of whose uncle Blsesus he did not wish to be forgotten. But this did not make Blsesus more famous, while the refusal of the honour heightened Dolabella's renown. He had, in fact, with a smaller army, brought back with him illustrious prisoners, and the fame of having slain the enemy's leader and terminated the war. In his train were envoys from the Garamantes, a rare spectacle in Rome. The nation, in its terror at the destruction of Tacferinus, and innocent of any guilty intention, had sent them to crave pardon of the Roman people. And now that this war had proved the zealous loyalty of Ptolemaeus, a custom of antiquity was revived, and one of the senators was sent to present him with an ivory sceptre and an embroidered robe, gifts anciently bestowed by the Senate, and to confer on him the titles of king, ally, and friend. The same summer the germs of a slave war in Italy were crushed by a fortunate accident. The originator of the movement was Titus Catisius, once a soldier of the Praetorian Guard. First by secret meetings at Brundisium and the neighbouring towns, then by placards publicly exhibited, he incited the rural and savage slave population of the remote forests to assert their freedom. By divine providence 3 vessels came to land for the use of those who traversed that sea. In the same part of the country, too, was Curtius Lupus, the quaestor, who, according to ancient precedent, had had the charge of the woodland pastures assigned to him. Putting in motion a force of marines, he broke up the seditious combination in its very first beginnings. The emperor at once sent Staius, a tribune, with a strong detachment, by whom the ringleader himself, with his most daring followers, were brought prisoners to Rome, where men already trembled at the vast scale of the slave establishments, in which there was an immense growth, while the freeborn populace daily decreased. That same consulship witnessed a horrible instance of misery and brutality. A father as defendant, a son as prosecutor, Vibius Serenus was the name of both, were brought before the Senate. The father, dragged from exile in filth and squalor, now stood in irons, while the son pleaded for his guilt. With studious elegance of dress and cheerful looks, the youth, at once accuser and witness, alleged a plot against the emperor, and that men had been sent to Gaul to excite rebellion, further adding that Caecilius Cornutus, an ex-praetor, had furnished money. Cornutus, weary of anxiety, and feeling that peril was equivalent to ruin, hastened to destroy himself. But the accused, with fearless spirit, looked his son in the face, shook his chains, and appealed to the vengeance of the gods, with a prayer that they would restore him to his exile, where he might live far away from such practices, and that, as for his son, punishment might sooner or later overtake him. He protested, too, that Cornutus was innocent, and that his terror was groundless, as would easily be perceived if other names were given up, for he never would have plotted the emperor's murder and a revolution with only one confederate. Upon this the prosecutor named Gnaeus Lentulus and Seius Tubero, to the great confusion of the emperor at finding a hostile rebellion and disturbance of the public peace charged on 2 leading men in the state, his own intimate friends, the first of whom was in extreme old age, and the second in very feeble health. They were, however, at once acquitted. As for the father, his slaves were examined by torture, and the result was unfavourable to the accuser. The man, maddened by remorse and terror-stricken by the popular voice, which menaced him with the dungeon, the rock, or a parricide's doom, fled from Rome. He was dragged back from Ravenna, and forced to go through the prosecution, during which Tiberius did not disguise the old grudge he bore the exile Serenus. For after Libo's conviction, Serenus had sent the emperor a letter, upbraiding him for not having rewarded his special zeal in that trial, with further hints more insolent than could be safely trusted to the easily offended ears of a despot. All this Tiberius revived 8 years later, charging on him various misconduct during that interval, even though the examination by torture, owing to the obstinacy of the slaves, had contradicted his guilt. The Senate then gave their votes that Serenus should be punished according to ancient precedent, when the emperor, to soften the odium of the affair, interposed with his veto. Next, Gallus Asinius proposed that he should be confined in Gyaros or Donusa, but this he rejected on the ground that both these islands were deficient in water, and that he whose life was spared ought to be allowed the necessaries of life. And so Serenus was conveyed back to Amorgus. In consequence of the suicide of Cornutus, it was proposed to deprive informers of their rewards whenever a person accused of treason put an end to his life by his own act before the completion of the trial. The motion was on the point of being carried, when the emperor, with a harshness contrary to his manner, spoke openly for the informers, complaining that the laws would be ineffective, and the state brought to the verge of ruin. Better, he said, to subvert the constitution than to remove its guardians. Thus the informers, a class invented to destroy the commonwealth, and never enough controlled even by legal penalties, were stimulated by rewards. Some little joy broke this long succession of horrors. Caius Cominius, a Roman knight, was spared by the emperor, against whom he was convicted of having written libellous verses, at the intercession of his brother, who was a senator. Hence it seemed the more amazing that one who knew better things, and the glory which waits on mercy, should prefer harsher courses. He did not indeed err from dullness, and it is easy to see when the acts of a sovereign meet with genuine, and when with fictitious popularity. And even he himself, though usually artificial in manner, and though his words escaped him with a seeming struggle, spoke out freely and fluently whenever he came to a man's rescue. In another case, that of Publius Suilius, formerly quaestor to Germanicus, who was to be expelled from Italy on a conviction of having received money for a judicial decision, he held that the man ought to be banished to an island, and so intensely strong was his feeling that he bound the Senate by an oath that this was a state necessity. The act was thought cruel at the moment, but subsequently it redounded to his honour when Suilius returned from exile. The next age saw him in tremendous power, and a venal creature of the Emperor Claudius, whose friendship he long used with success, never for good. The same punishment was adjudged to Catus Firmius, a senator, for having, it was alleged, assailed his sister with a false charge of treason. Catus, as I have related, had drawn Libo into a snare, and then destroyed him by an information. Tiberius, remembering this service, while he alleged other reasons, deprecated a sentence of exile, but did not oppose his expulsion from the Senate. Much of what I have related, and shall have to relate, may perhaps, I am aware, seem petty trifles to record. But no one must compare my annals with the writings of those who have described Rome in old days. They told of great wars, of the storming of cities, of the defeat and capture of kings, or, whenever they turned by preference to home affairs, they related, with a free scope for digression, the strifes of consuls with tribunes, land and corn laws, and the struggles between the commons and the aristocracy. My labours are circumscribed and inglorious, peace wholly unbroken, or but slightly disturbed, dismal misery in the capital, an emperor careless about the enlargement of the empire, such is my theme. Still it will not be useless to study those at first sight trifling events out of which the movements of vast changes often take their rise. All nations and cities are ruled by the people, the nobility, or by one man. A constitution formed by selection out of these elements it is easy to commend, but not to produce, or if it is produced, it cannot be lasting. Formerly, when the people had power, or when the patricians were in the ascendant, the popular temper and the methods of controlling it had to be studied, and those who knew most accurately the spirit of the Senate and aristocracy had the credit of understanding the age and of being wise men. So now, after a revolution, when Rome is nothing but the realm of a single despot, there must be good in carefully noting and recording this period, for it is but few who have the foresight to distinguish right from wrong, or what is sound from what is hurtful, while most men learn wisdom from the fortunes of others. Still, though this is instructive, it gives very little pleasure. Descriptions of countries, the various incidents of battles, glorious deaths of great generals, enchain and refresh a reader's mind. I have to present in succession the merciless biddings of a tyrant, incessant prosecutions, faithless friendships, the ruin of innocence, the same causes issuing in the same results, and I am everywhere confronted by a wearisome monotony in my subject matter. Then again, an ancient historian has but few disparagers, and no one cares whether you praise more heartily the armies of Carthage or Rome. But of many who endured punishment or disgrace under Tiberius, the descendants yet survive, or even though the families themselves may be now extinct, you will find those who, from a resemblance of character, imagine that the evil deeds of others are a reproach to themselves. Again, even honour and virtue make enemies, condemning as they do their opposites by too close a contrast. But I return to my work. In the year of the consulship of Cornelius Cossus and Asinius Agrippa, Cremutius Cordus was arraigned on a new charge, now for the first time heard. He had published a history in which he had praised Marcus Brutus, and called Gaius Cassius the last of the Romans. His accusers were Satrius Secundus and Pinarius Natter, creatures of Sejanus. This was enough to ruin the accused, and then, too, the emperor listened with an angry frown to his defence, which Cremutius, resolved to give up his life, began thus: "It is my words, senators, which are condemned, so innocent am I of any guilty act. Yet these do not touch the emperor or the emperor's mother, who are alone comprehended under the law of treason. I am said to have praised Brutus and Cassius, whose careers many have described, and no one mentioned without eulogy. Titus Livius, preeminently famous for eloquence and truthfulness, extolled Cneius Pompeius in such a panegyric that Augustus called him Pompeianus, and yet this was no obstacle to their friendship. Scipio, Afranius, this very Cassius, this same Brutus, he nowhere describes as brigands and traitors, terms now applied to them, but repeatedly as illustrious men. Asinius Pollio's writings too hand down a glorious memory of them, and Messala Corvinus used to speak with pride of Cassius as his general. Yet both these men prospered to the end with wealth and preferment. Again, that book of Marcus Cicero, in which he lauded Cato to the skies, how else was it answered by Caesar the dictator than by a written oration in reply, as if he was pleading in court? The letters of Antonius, the harangues of Brutus, contain reproaches against Augustus, false indeed, but urged with powerful sarcasm. The poems which we read of Bibaculus and Catullus are crammed with invectives on the Caesars. Yet the divine Julius, the divine Augustus themselves bore all this, and let it pass. Whether in forbearance or in wisdom, I cannot easily say. Assuredly, what is despised is soon forgotten. When you resent a thing, you seem to recognize it. Of the Greeks I say nothing. With them not only liberty, but even license went unpunished, or if a person aimed at chastising, he retaliated on satire by satire. It has, however, always been perfectly open to us, without any one to censure, to speak freely of those whom death has withdrawn alike from the partialities of hatred or esteem. Are Cassius and Brutus now in arms on the fields of Philippi, and am I with them rousing the people by harangues to stir up civil war? Did they not fall more than 70 years ago, and as they are known to us by statues which even the conqueror did not destroy, so too is not some portion of their memory preserved for us by historians. To every man posterity gives his due honour, and if a fatal sentence hangs over me, there will be those who will remember me as well as Cassius and Brutus. He then left the Senate, and ended his life by starvation. His books, so the senators decreed, were to be burnt by the aediles, but some copies were left which were concealed, and afterwards published. And so one is all the more inclined to laugh at the stupidity of men who suppose that the despotism of the present can actually efface the remembrances of the next generation. On the contrary, the persecution of genius fosters its influence. Foreign tyrants and all who have imitated their oppression have merely procured infamy for themselves and glory for their victims. That year was such a continuous succession of prosecutions that on the days of the Latin festival, when Drusus, as city prefect, had ascended his tribunal for the inauguration of his office, Calpurnius Salvianus appeared before him against Sextus Marius. This the emperor openly censured, and it caused the banishment of Salvianus. Next, the people of Cyzicus were accused of publicly neglecting the established worship of the divine Augustus, and also of acts of violence to Roman citizens. They were deprived of the franchise which they had earned during the war with Mithridates, when their city was besieged, and when they repulsed the king, as much by their own bravery as by the aid of Lucullus. Then followed the acquittal of Fonteius Capito, the late proconsul of Asia, on proof that charges brought against him by Vibius Serenus were fictitious. Still this did not injure Serenus, to whom public hatred was actually a protection. Indeed, any conspicuously restless informer was, so to say, inviolable. Only the insignificant and undistinguished were punished. About the same time, further Spain sent a deputation to the Senate, with a request to be allowed, after the example of Asia, to erect a temple to Tiberius and his mother. On this occasion the emperor, who had generally a strong contempt for honours, and now thought it right to reply to the rumour which reproached him with having yielded to vanity, delivered the following speech. I am aware, senators, that many deplore my want of firmness in not having opposed a similar recent petition from the cities of Asia. I will therefore both explain the grounds of my previous silence and my intentions for the future. Inasmuch as the divine Augustus did not forbid the founding of a temple at Pergamos to himself and to the city of Rome, I, who respect as law all his actions and sayings, have the more readily followed a precedent once approved, seeing that with the worship of myself was linked an expression of reverence towards the Senate. But though it may be pardonable to have allowed this once, it would be a vain and arrogant thing to receive the sacred honour of images representing the divine throughout all the provinces, and the homage paid to Augustus will disappear if it is vulgarized by indiscriminate flattery. For myself, senators, I am mortal and limited to the functions of humanity, content if I can adequately fill the highest place. Of this I solemnly assure you, and would have posterity remember it. They will more than sufficiently honour my memory by believing me to have been worthy of my ancestry, watchful over your interests, courageous in danger, fearless of enmity when the state required it. These sentiments of your hearts are my temples, these my most glorious and abiding monuments. Those built of stone are despised as mere tombs, if the judgment of posterity passes into hatred, and therefore this is my prayer to our allies, our citizens, and to heaven itself, to the last, that to my life's close it grant me a tranquil mind, which can discern alike human and divine claims, to the first, that when I die, they honour my career and the reputation of my name with praise and kindly remembrance. Henceforth Tiberius, even in private conversations, persisted in showing contempt for such homage to himself. Some attributed this to modesty, many to self-distrust, a few to a mean spirit. The noblest men, it was said, have the loftiest aspirations, and so Hercules and Bacchus among the Greeks, and Quirinus among us, were enrolled in the number of the gods. Augustus did better, seeing that he had aspired. All other things princes have as a matter of course. One thing they ought insatiably to pursue, that their memory may be glorious. For to despise fame is to despise merit. End of Book 4, Part 2. Recording by Graham Redman.
Book 4, Part 3 of The Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus. Translated by Alfred John Church and William Jackson Brodrib. Book 4, AD 23 to 28, Part 3. Sejanus desires the widow of Drusus in marriage. Sejanus, meanwhile, dazed by his extravagant prosperity, and urged on too by a woman's passion, Livia now insisting on his promise of marriage, addressed a memorial to the emperor, for it was then the custom to apply to him by writing, even though he was at Rome. This petition was to the following effect: the kindness of Augustus the father, and then the many favourable testimonies of Tiberius the son, had engendered the habit of confiding his hopes and wishes to the ears of emperors as readily as to those of the gods. The splendour of high distinctions he had never craved. He had rather chosen watchings and hardships, like one of the common soldiers, for the emperor's safety. But there was one most glorious honour he had won: the reputation of being worthy of an alliance with a Caesar. This was the first motive of his ambition, as he had heard that Augustus, in marrying his daughter, had even entertained some thoughts of Roman knights. So if a husband was sought for Livia, he hoped Tiberius would bear in mind a friend who would find his reward simply in the glory of the alliance. He did not wish to rid himself of the duties imposed on him. He thought it enough for his family to be secured against the unjust displeasure of Agrippina, and this for the sake of his children. For, as for himself, enough and more than enough for him would be a life completed while such a sovereign still reigned. Tiberius, in reply, after praising the loyal sentiments of Sejanus, and briefly enumerating the favours he had bestowed on him, asked time for impartial consideration, adding that while other men's plans depended on their ideas of their own interest, princes, who had to regulate their chief actions by public opinion, were in a different position. Hence, he said, I do not take refuge in an answer which it would be easy to return, that Livia can herself decide whether she considers that, after Drusus, she ought again to marry, or rather to enjoy life in the same home, and that she has in her mother and grandmother counsellors nearer and dearer to her. I will deal more frankly. First, as to the enmity of Agrippina, I maintain that it will blaze out more fiercely if Livia's marriage rends, so to say, the house of the Caesars into two factions. Even as it is, feminine jealousies break out, and my grandsons are torn asunder by the strife. What will happen if the rivalry is rendered more intense by such a marriage? For you are mistaken, Sejanus, if you think that you will then remain in the same position, and that Livia, who has been the wife of Caius Caesar and afterwards of Drusus, will have the inclination to pass her old age with a mere Roman knight. Though I might allow it, do you imagine it would be tolerated by those who have seen her brother, her father, and our ancestors in the highest offices of state? You indeed desire to keep within your station, but those magistrates and nobles who intrude on you against your wishes, and consult you on all matters, openly give out that you have long overstepped the rank of a knight, and gone far beyond my father's friendships, and from their dislike of you they also condemn me. But, you say, Augustus had thoughts of giving his daughter to a Roman knight. Is it surprising that, with so many distracting cares, foreseeing too the immense elevation to which a man would be raised above others by such an alliance, he talked of Caius Proculius and certain persons of singularly quiet life, wholly free from political entanglements? Still, if the hesitation of Augustus is to influence us, how much stronger is the fact that he bestowed his daughter on Marcus Agrippa than on myself? All this, as a friend, I have stated without reserve, but I will not oppose your plans or those of Livia. My own earnest thoughts, and the ties with which I am still purposing to unite you to myself, I shall for the present forbear to explain. This only I will declare, that nothing is too grand to be deserved by your merits and your goodwill towards me. When an opportunity presents itself, either in the Senate or in a popular assembly, I shall not be silent. Sejanus, no longer thinking of his marriage, but filled with a deeper alarm, rejoined by deprecating the whispers of suspicion, popular rumour, and the gathering storm of odium. That he might not impair his influence by closing his doors on the throngs of his many visitors, or strengthen the hands of accusers by admitting them, he made it his aim to induce Tiberius to live in some charming spot at a distance from Rome. In this he foresaw several advantages. Access to the emperor would be under his own control, and letters, for the most part, being conveyed by soldiers, would pass through his hands. Caesar, too, who was already in the decline of life, would soon, when enervated by retirement, more readily transfer to him the functions of empire. Envy towards himself would be lessened when there was an end to his crowded levies, and the reality of power would be increased by the removal of its empty show. So he began to declaim against the laborious life of the capital, the bustling crowds and streaming multitudes, while he praised repose and solitude, with their freedom from vexations and misunderstandings, and their special opportunities for the study of the highest questions. It happened that the trial at this time of Vercinus Montanus, a popular wit, convinced the hesitating Tiberius that he ought to shun all assemblies of the Senate, where speeches, often true and offensive, were flung in his very face. Vaccinius was charged with insulting expressions towards the emperor, and while the witness, Aemilius, a military man, in his eagerness to prove the case, repeated the whole story and amid angry clamour struggled on with loud assertion, Tiberius heard the reproaches by which he was assailed in secret, and was so deeply impressed that he exclaimed that he would clear himself either at once or on a legal inquiry, and the entreaties of friends, with the flattery of the whole assembly, hardly restored his composure. As for Vaccinius, he suffered the penalty of treason, but the emperor, clinging all the more obstinately to the harshness with which he had been reproached in regard to accused persons, punished Aquilia with exile for the crime of adultery with Varius Ligur, although Lentulus Gaetulicus, the consul-elect, had proposed that she should be sentenced under the Julian law. He next struck off Appidius Merilla from the register of the Senate for not having sworn obedience to the legislation of the divine Augustus. Then a hearing was given to embassies from the Lacedaemonians and Messenians on the question of the temple of Diana in the marshes. The Lacedaemonians asserted that it had been dedicated by their ancestors and in their territory, and appealed to the records of their history and the hymns of poets, but it had been wrested from, they said, by the arms of the Macedonian Philip, with whom they had fought, and subsequently restored by the decision of Caius Caesar and Marcus Antonius. The Messenians, on the contrary, alleged the ancient division of the Peloponnesus among the descendants of Hercules, in which the territory of Denthelia, where the temple stood, had fallen to their king. Records of this event still existed, engraven on stone and ancient bronze. But if they were asked for the testimony of poetry and of history, they had it, they said, in greater abundance and authenticity. Philip had not decided arbitrarily, but according to fact, and King Antigonus, as also the general Mummius, had pronounced the same judgment. Such too had been the award of the Milesians, to whom the arbitration had been publicly entrusted, and, finally, of Attidius Germanus, the praetor of Achaia. And so the question was decided in favour of the Messenians. Next, the people of Segesta petitioned for the restoration of the temple of Venus at Mount Eryx, which had fallen to ruin from its antiquity. They repeated the well-known story of its origin, which delighted Tiberius. He undertook the work willingly, as being a kinsman of the goddess. After this was discussed a petition from the city of Massilia, and sanction given to the precedent of Publius Rutilius, who, having been legally banished from Rome, had been adopted as a citizen by the people of Smyrna. Volcatius Moscus, also an exile, had been received with a similar privilege by the inhabitants of Massilia, and had left his property to their community, as being now his own country. 2 men of noble rank died in that year, Gnaeus Lentulus and Lucius Domitius. It had been the glory of Lentulus, to say nothing of his consulship and his triumphal distinctions over the Gaetuli, to have borne poverty with a good grace, then to have attained great wealth, which had been blamelessly acquired and was modestly enjoyed. Domitius derived lustre from a father who during the civil war had been master of the sea, till he united himself to the party of Antonius and afterwards to that of Caesar. His grandfather had fallen in the battle of Thessalia, fighting for the aristocracy. He had himself been chosen to be the husband of the younger Antonia, daughter of Octavia, and subsequently led an army across the Elbe, penetrating further into Germany than any Roman before him. For this achievement he gained triumphal honours. Lucius Antonius too then died, of a most illustrious but unfortunate family. His father, Julius Antonius, was capitally punished for adultery with Julia, and the son, when a mere youth, was banished by Augustus, whose sister's grandson he was, to the city of Massilia, where the name of exile might be masked under that of student. Yet honour was paid him in death, and his bones, by the Senate's decree, were consigned to the sepulchra of the Octavi. While the same consuls were in office, an atrocious crime was committed in Nero, Spain, by a peasant of the Temestine tribe. Suddenly attacking the praetor of the province, Lucius Piso, as he was travelling in all the carelessness of peace, he killed him with a single wound. He then fled on a swift horse, and reached a wooded country, where he parted with his steed, and eluded pursuit amid rocky and pathless wilds. But he was soon discovered. The horse was caught, and led through the neighbouring villages, and its owner ascertained. Being found and put to the torture that he might be forced to reveal his accomplices, he exclaimed in a loud voice, in the language of his country, that it was in vain to question him. His comrades might stand by and look on, but that the most intense agony would not wring the truth from him. Next day, when he was dragged back to torture, he broke loose from his guards, and dashed his head against a stone with such violence that he instantly fell dead. It was, however, believed that Piso was treacherously murdered by the Temestinae. Some public money had been embezzled, and he was pressing for its payment too rigorously for the patience of barbarians. In the consulship of Lentulus Gaetulicus and Caius Calvisius, triumphal distinctions were decreed to Poppaeus Sabinus for a crushing defeat of some Thracian tribes, whose wild life in the highlands of a mountainous country made them unusually fierce. Besides their natural ferocity, the rebellion had its origin in their scornful refusal to endure levies and to supply our armies with their bravest men. Even native princes they would obey only according to their caprice, and if they sent aid, they used to appoint their own leaders and fight only against their neighbours. A rumour had then spread itself amongst them that, dispersed and mingled with other tribes, they were to be dragged away to distant countries. Before, however, they took up arms, they sent envoys with assurances of their friendship and loyalty, which they said would continue if they were not tried by any fresh burden. But if they were doomed to slavery as a conquered people, they had swords and young warriors, and a spirit bent on freedom, or resigned to death. As they spoke, they pointed to fortresses amid rocks, whither they had conveyed their parents and their wives, and threatened us with a difficult, dangerous, and sanguinary war. Sabinus, meantime, while he was concentrating his troops, returned gentle answers. But on the arrival of Pomponius Labeo with a legion from Mysia, and of King Rhemotalces with some reinforcements from his subjects, who had not thrown off their allegiance, with these and the force he had on the spot, he advanced on the enemy, who were drawn up in some wooded defiles. Some ventured to show themselves on the open hills. These the Roman general approached in fighting order, and easily dislodged them, with only a small slaughter of the barbarians, who had not far to flee. In this position he soon established a camp, and held with a strong detachment a narrow and unbroken mountain ridge, stretching as far as the next fortress, which was garrisoned by a large force of armed soldiers along with some irregulars. Against the boldest of these, who after the manner of their country were disporting themselves with songs and dances in front of the rampart, he sent some picked archers who, discharging distant volleys, inflicted many wounds without loss to themselves. As they advanced, a sudden sortie put them to the rout, and they fell back on the support of a Segumbrian cohort, drawn up at no great distance by the Roman general, ready for any emergency, and as terrible as the foe, with the noise of their war songs and the clashing of their arms. He then moved his camp near to the enemy, leaving in his former entrenchments the Thracians who, as I have mentioned, were with us. These had permission to ravage, burn, and plunder, provided they confined their forays to daylight, and passed the night securely and vigilantly in their camp. This at first they strictly observed. Soon they resigned themselves to enjoyment, and, enriched by plunder, they neglected their guards, and amid feasts and mirth sank down in the carelessness of the banquet, of sleep, and of wine. So the enemy, apprised of their heedlessness, prepared 2 detachments, one of which was to attack the plunderers, the other to fall on the Roman camp, not with the hope of taking it, but to hinder the din of the other battle from being heard by our soldiers, who, with shouts and missiles around them, would be all intent on their own peril. Night, too, was chosen for the movement to increase the panic. Those, however, who tried to storm the entrenchment of the legions were easily repulsed. The Thracian auxiliaries were dismayed by the suddenness of the onset, for though some were lying close to their lines, far more were straggling beyond them, and the massacre was all the more savage, inasmuch as they were taunted with being fugitives and traitors, and bearing arms for their own and their country's enslavement. Next day Sabinus displayed his forces in the plain, on the chance of the Barbarians being encouraged by the night's success to risk an engagement. Finding that they did not quit the fortress and the adjoining hills, he began a siege by means of the works which he had opportunely begun to construct. Then he drew a fosse and stockade enclosing an extent of 4 miles, and by degrees contracted and narrowed his lines, with the view of cutting off their water and forage. He also threw up a rampart, from which to discharge stones, darts, and brands on the enemy, who was now within range. It was thirst, however, which chiefly distressed them, for there was only one spring for the use of a vast multitude of soldiers and non-combatants. Their cattle, too, penned up close to them, after the fashion of barbarians, were dying of want of fodder. Near them lay human bodies which had perished from wounds or thirst, and the whole place was befouled with rotting carcasses, and stench and infection. To their confusion was added the growing misery of discord, some thinking of surrender, others of destruction by mutual blows. Some there were who suggested a sortie instead of an avenged death, and these were all men of spirit, though they differed in their plans. One of their chiefs, Dinas, an old man who well knew by long experience both the strength and clemency of Rome, maintained that they must lay down their arms, this being the only remedy for their wretched plight, and he was the first to give himself up with his wife and children to the conqueror. He was followed by all whom age or sex unfitted for war, by all too who had a stronger love of life than of renown. The young were divided between Tarsa and Chersonesus, both of whom had resolved to fall together with their freedom. Tarsa, however, kept urging them to speedy death, and to the instant breaking off of all hope and fear, and, by way of example, plunged his sword into his heart. And there were some who chose the same death. Chersonesus and his band waited for night, not without the knowledge of our general. Consequently, the sentries were strengthened with denser masses of troops. Night was coming on with a fierce storm, and the foe, one moment with a tumultuous uproar, another in awful silence, had perplexed the besiegers, when Sabinus went round the camp, entreating the men not to give a chance to their stealthy assailants by heeding embarrassing noises, or being deceived by quiet, but to keep every one to his post without moving or discharging their darts on false alarms. The barbarians, meanwhile, rushed down with their bands, now hurling at the entrenchments stones such as the hand could grasp, stakes with points hardened by fire, and boughs lopped from oaks, now filling up the fosses with bushes and hurdles and dead bodies, while others advanced up to the breastwork with bridges and ladders which they had constructed for the occasion, seized it, tore it down, and came to close quarters with the defenders. Our soldiers on the other side drove them back with missiles, repelled them with their shields, and covered them with a storm of long siege javelins and heaps of stones. Success already gained, and the more marked disgrace which would follow repulse, were a stimulus to the Romans, while the courage of the foe was heightened by this last chance of deliverance, and the presence of many mothers and wives with mournful cries. Darkness, which increased the daring of some and the terror of others, random blows, wounds not foreseen, failure to recognize friend or enemy, echoes, seemingly in their rear, from the winding mountain valleys, spread such confusion that the Romans abandoned some of their lines in the belief that they had been stormed. Only, however, a very few of the enemy had broken through them. The rest, after their bravest men had been beaten back or wounded, were towards daybreak pushed back to the upper part of the fortress, and there at last compelled to surrender. Then the immediate neighbourhood, by the voluntary action of the inhabitants, submitted. The early and severe winter of Mount Haemus saved the rest of the population from being reduced by assault or blockade. At Rome, meanwhile, besides the shocks already sustained by the imperial house, came the first step towards the destruction of Agrippina, Claudia Pulchra, her cousin, being prosecuted by Domitius Afer, lately a praetor, a man of but moderate position, and eager to become notorious by any sort of deed. Afer charged her with unchastity, with having Furnius for her paramour, and with attempts on the emperor by poison and sorcery. Agrippina, always impetuous, and now kindled into fury by the peril of her kinswoman, went straight to Tiberius and found him, as it happened, offering a sacrifice to his father. This provoked an indignant outburst. "It is not," she exclaimed, "for the same man to slay victims to the divine Augustus, and to persecute his posterity. The celestial spirit has not transferred itself to the mute statue. Here is the true image, sprung of heavenly blood, and she perceives her danger, and assumes its mournful emblems. Pulchra's name is a mere blind. The only reason for her destruction is that she has, in utter folly, selected Agrippina for her admiration, forgetting that Sozia was thereby ruined." These words wrung from the emperor one of the rare utterances of that inscrutable breast. He rebuked Agrippina with a Greek verse, and reminded her that she was not wronged because she was not a queen. Pulchra and Furnius were condemned. Afer was ranked with the foremost orators for the ability which he displayed, and which won strong praise from Tiberius, who pronounced him a speaker of natural genius. Henceforward, as a counsel for the defence or the prosecution, he enjoyed the fame of eloquence rather than of virtue, but old age robbed him of much of his speaking power, while, with a failing intellect, he was still impatient of silence. Agrippina, in stubborn rage, with the grasp of disease yet on her, when the emperor came to see her, wept long and silently, and then began to mingle reproach and supplication. She begged him to relieve her loneliness and provide her with a husband. Her youth still fitted her for marriage, which was a virtuous woman's only solace, and there were citizens in Rome who would not disdain to receive the wife of Germanicus and his children. But the emperor, who perceived the political aims of her request, but did not wish to show displeasure or apprehension, left her, notwithstanding her urgency, without an answer. This incident, not mentioned by any historian, I have found in the memoirs of the younger Agrippina, the mother of the Emperor Nero, who handed down to posterity the story of her life and of the misfortunes of her family. Sejanus, meanwhile, yet more deeply alarmed the sorrowing and unsuspecting woman by sending his agents, under the guise of friendship, with warnings that poison was prepared for her, and that she ought to avoid her father-in-law's table. Knowing not how to dissemble, she relaxed neither her features nor tone of voice as she sat by him at dinner, nor did she touch a single dish, till at last Tiberius noticed her conduct, either casually or because he was told of it. To test her more closely, he praised some fruit as it was set on the table, and passed it with his own hand to his daughter-in-law. This increased the suspicions of Agrippina, and without putting the fruit to her lips, she gave it to the slaves. Still no remark fell from Tiberius before the company, but he turned to his mother and whispered that it was not surprising if he had decided on harsh treatment against one who implied that he was a poisoner. Then there was a rumour that a plan was laid for her destruction, that the emperor did not dare to attempt it openly, and was seeking to veil the deed in secrecy. Tiberius, to divert people's talk, continually attended the Senate, and gave an audience of several days to embassies from Asia on a disputed question as to the city in which the temple before mentioned should be erected. 11 cities were rivals for the honour, of which they were all equally ambitious, though they differed widely in resources. With little variation they dwelt on antiquity of race and loyalty to Rome throughout her wars with Perseus, Aristonicus, and other kings. But the people of Hypatia, Tralles, Laodicea, and Magnesia were passed over as too insignificant. Even Ilium, though it boasted that Troy was the cradle of Rome, was strong only in the glory of its antiquity. There was a little hesitation about Halicarnassus, as its inhabitants affirmed that for 1200 years their homes had not been shaken by an earthquake, and that the foundations of their temple were on the living rock. Pergamos, it was thought, had been sufficiently honoured by having a temple of Augustus in the city, on which very fact they relied. The Ephesians and Milesians had, it seemed, wholly devoted their respective towns to the worships of Apollo and Diana, and so the question lay between Sardis and Smyrna. The envoys from Sardis read a decree of the Etrurians with whom they claimed kindred. Tyrrhenus and Lydus, it was said, the sons of King Attis, divided the nation between them because of its multitude. Lydus remained in the country of his fathers. Tyrrhenus had the work assigned him of establishing new settlements, and names, taken from the two leaders, were given to the one people in Asia and to the other in Italy. The resources of the Lydians were yet further augmented by the immigration of nations into that part of Greece which afterwards took its name from Pelops. They spoke too of letters from Roman generals, of treaties concluded with us during the Macedonian War, and of their copious rivers, of their climate, and the rich countries around them. The envoys from Smyrna, after tracing their city's antiquity back to such founders as either Tantalus the son of Jupiter, or Theseus, also of divine origin, or one of the Amazons, passed on to that on which they chiefly relied, their services to the Roman people, whom they had helped with naval armaments, not only in wars abroad, but in those under which we struggled in Italy. They had also been the first, they said, to build a temple in honour of Rome during the consulship of Marcus Porcius Cato, when Rome's power indeed was great, but not yet raised to the highest point, inasmuch as the Punic capital was still standing, and there were mighty kings in Asia. They appealed too to the of Lucius Sulla, whose army was once in terrible jeopardy from a severe winter and want of clothing, and this having been announced at Smyrna in a public assembly, all who were present stripped their clothes off their backs and sent them to our legions. And so the Senate, when the question was put, gave the preference to Smyrna. Vibius Marsus moved that Marcus Lepidus, to whom the province of Asia had been assigned, should have under him a special commissioner to undertake the charge of this temple. As Lepidus himself, out of modesty, declined to appoint, Valerius Naso, one of the ex-praetors, was chosen by lot and sent out. End of Part 3.
Book 4, Part 4 of the Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus, translated by Alfred John Church and William Jackson Brodrib. Book 4, AD 23-28, Part 4. Tiberius retires from Rome. Meanwhile, after long reflection on his purpose and frequent deferment of it, the emperor retired to Campania to dedicate, as he pretended, a temple to Jupiter at Capua and another to Augustus at Nola, but really resolved to live at a distance from Rome. Although I have followed most historians in attributing the cause of his retirement to the arts of Sejanus, still, as he passed 6 consecutive years in the same solitude after that minister's destruction, I am often in doubt whether it is not to be more truly ascribed to himself, and his wish to hide by the place of his retreat the cruelty and licentiousness which he betrayed by his actions. Some thought that in his old age he was ashamed of his personal appearance. He had indeed a tall, singularly slender and stooping figure, a bald head, in a face full of eruptions, and covered here and there with plasters. In the seclusion of Rhodes he had habituated himself to shun society and to hide his voluptuous life. According to one account, his mother's domineering temper drove him away. He was weary of having her as his partner in power, and he could not thrust her aside, because he had received this very power as her gift. For Augustus had had thoughts of putting the Roman state under Germanicus, his sister's grandson, whom all men esteemed, but yielding to his wife's entreaties he left Germanicus to be adopted by Tiberius, and adopted Tiberius himself. With this Augusta would taunt her son, and claim back what she had given. His departure was attended by a small retinue, one senator, who was an ex-consul, Cocceius Nerva, learned in the laws, one Roman knight, besides Sejanus, of the highest order, Curtius Atticus, the rest being men of liberal culture, for the most part Greeks, in whose conversation he might find amusement. It was said by men who knew the stars that the motions of the heavenly bodies when Tiberius left Rome were such as to forbid the possibility of his return. This caused ruin for many who conjectured that his end was near, and spread the rumour, for they never foresaw the very improbable contingency of his voluntary exile from his home for 11 years. Soon afterwards it was clearly seen what a narrow margin there is between science and delusion, and in what obscurity truth is veiled. That he would not return to Rome was not a mere random assertion. As to the rest, they were wholly in the dark, seeing that he lived to extreme old age in the country or on the coast near Rome, and often close to the very walls of the city. It happened at this time that a perilous accident which occurred to the emperor strengthened vague rumours and gave him grounds for trusting more fully in the friendship and fidelity of Sejanus. They were dining in a country house called the Cave, between the Gulf of Amyclae and the hills of Fundi, in a natural grotto. The rocks at its entrance suddenly fell in and crushed some of the attendants. Thereupon panic seized the whole company, and there was a general flight of the guests. Sejanus hung over the emperor, and with knee, face, and hand encountered the falling stones, and was found in this attitude by the soldiers who came to their rescue. After this he was greater than ever, and though his counsels were ruinous, he was listened to with confidence, as a man who had no care for himself. He pretended to act as a judge toward the children of Germanicus, after having suborned person to assume the part of prosecutors and to inveigh specially against Nero, next in succession to the throne, who, though he had proper youthful modesty, often forgot present expediency, while freedmen and clients, eager to get power, incited him to display vigor and self-confidence. This, they said, was what the Roman people wished, what the armies desired, and Sejanus would not dare to oppose it, though now he insulted alike the tame spirit of the old emperor and the timidity of the young prince. Nero, while he listened to this and like talk, was indeed not inspired with any guilty ambition, but still occasionally there would break from him wilful and thoughtless expression, which spies about his person caught up and reported with exaggeration, and this he had no opportunity of rebutting. Then again alarms under various forms were continually arising. One man would avoid meeting him, another, after returning his salutation, would instantly turn away. Many, after beginning a conversation, would instantly break it off, while Sejanus's friends would stand their ground and laugh at him. Tiberius, indeed, wore an angry frown or a treacherous smile. Whether the young prince spoke or held his tongue, silence and speech were alike criminal. Every night had its anxieties, for his sleepless hours, his dreams and sighs were all made known by his wife to her mother Livia, and by Livia to Sejanus. Nero's brother Drusus, Sejanus actually drew into his scheme by holding out to him the prospect of becoming emperor through the removal of an elder brother, already all but fallen. The savage temper of Drusus, to say nothing of lust of power and the usual feuds between brothers, was inflamed with envy by the partiality of the mother Agrippina towards Nero. And yet Sejanus, while he favoured Drusus, was not without thoughts of sowing the seeds of his future reign, well knowing how very impetuous he was, and therefore the more exposed to treachery. Towards the close of the year died two distinguished men, Asinius Agrippa and Quintus Haterius. Agrippa was of illustrious rather than ancient ancestry, which his career did not disgrace. Haterius was of a senatorian family and famous for his eloquence while he lived, though the monuments which remain of his genius are not admired as of old. The truth is, he succeeded more by vehemence than by finish of style. While the research and labours of other authors are valued by an after age, the harmonious fluency of Haterius died with him. In the year of the consulship of Marcus Licinius and Lucius Calpurnius, the losses of a great war were matched by an unexpected disaster, no sooner begun than ended. One Attilius, of the freedman class, having undertaken to build an amphitheatre at Fidena for the exhibition of a show of gladiators, failed to lay a solid foundation to frame the wooden superstructure with beams of sufficient strength, for he had neither an abundance of wealth nor zeal for public popularity, but he had simply sought the work for sordid gain. Thither flocked all who loved such sights, and who, during the reign of Tiberius, had been wholly debarred from such amusements, men and women of every age crowding to the place because it was near Rome. And so the calamity was all the more fatal. The building was densely crowded, then came a violent shock, as it fell inwards or spread outwards, precipitating and burying an immense multitude, which was intently gazing on the show or standing round. Those who were crushed to death in the first moment of the accident had, at least, under such dreadful circumstances, the advantage of escaping torture. More to be pitied were they who with limbs torn from them still retained life, while they recognized their wives and children by seeing them during the day and by hearing in the night their screams and groans. Soon all the neighbors, in their excitement at the report, were bewailing brothers, kinsmen, or parents. Even those whose friends or relatives were away from home for quite a different reason still trembled for them, and as it was not yet known who had been destroyed by the crash, suspense made the alarm more widespread. As soon as they began to remove the debris, there was a rush to see the lifeless forms and much embracing and kissing. Often a dispute would arise, when some distorted face, bearing, however, a general resemblance of form and age, had baffled their efforts at recognition. 50,000 persons were maimed or destroyed in this disaster. For the future it was provided by a decree of the Senate that no one was to exhibit a show of gladiators whose fortune fell short of 400,000 sesterces, and that no amphitheatre was to be erected except on a foundation the solidity of which had been examined. Attilius was banished. At the moment of the calamity the nobles threw open houses and supplied indiscriminately medicines and physicians, so that Rome then, notwithstanding her sorrowful aspect, wore a likeness to the manners of our forefathers, who after a great battle always relieved the wounded with their bounty and attentions. This disaster was not forgotten when a furious conflagration damaged the capital to an unusual extent, reducing Mount Caelius to ashes. It was an ill-starred year, people began to say, and the emperor's purpose of leaving Rome must have been formed under evil omens. They began in vulgar fashion to trace ill luck to guilt, when Tiberius checked them by distributing money in proportion to losses sustained. He received a vote of thanks in the Senate from its distinguished members, and was applauded by the populace for having assisted, with his liberality, without partiality or the solicitations of friends, strangers whom he had himself sought out. And proposals were also made that Mount Caelius should for the future be called Mount Augustus, inasmuch as when all around was in flames only a single statue of Tiberius in the house of one Junius, a senator, had remained uninjured. This, it was said, had formerly happened to Claudia Quinta. Her statue, which had twice escaped the violence of fire, had been dedicated by our ancestors in the temple of the Mother of Gods. Hence the Claudii had been accounted sacred and numbered among deities, and so additional sanctity ought to be given to a spot where heaven showed such honor to the emperor. It will not be uninteresting to mention that Mount Caelius was anciently known by the name of Querquentillanus, because it grew oak timber in abundance, and was afterwards called Caelius by Caelius Vibina, who led the Etruscan people to the aid of Rome, and had the place given him as a possession by Tarquinius Priscus, or by some other of the kings. As to that point historians differ. As to the rest, it is beyond a question that Vibina's numerous forces established themselves in the plain beneath and in the neighbourhood of the Forum, and that the Tuscan street was named after these strangers. But though the zeal of the nobles and the bounty of the prince brought relief to suffering, yet every day a stronger and fiercer host of informers pursued its victims, without one alleviating circumstance. Quintilius Varus, a rich man and related to the emperor, was suddenly attacked by Domitius Afer, the successful prosecutor of Claudia Pulchra, his mother, and no one wondered that the needy adventurer of so many years, who had squandered his lately gotten recompense, was now preparing himself for fresh iniquities. That Publius Dolabella should have associated himself in the prosecution was a marvel, for he was of illustrious ancestry, and was allied to Varus, and was now himself seeking to destroy his own noble race, his own kindred. The Senate, however, stopped the proceedings, and decided to wait for the emperor, this being the only means of escaping for a time impending horrors. Caesar, meanwhile, after dedicating the temples in Campania, warned the public by an edict not to disturb his retirement, and posted soldiers here and there to keep off the throngs of townsfolk. But he so loathed the towns and colonies, and in short every place on the mainland, that he buried himself in the island of Capri, which is separated by 3 miles of strait from the extreme point of the promontory of Sorrentum. The solitude of the place was, I believe, its chief attraction, for a harbourless sea surrounds it, and even for a small vessel it has but few safe retreats, nor can anyone land unknown to the sentries. Its air in winter is soft, as it is screened by a mountain, which is a protection against cutting winds. In summer it catches the western breezes, and the open sea round it renders it most delightful. It commanded, too, a prospect of the most lovely bay, till Vesuvius, bursting into flames, changed the face of the country. Greeks, so tradition says, occupied those parts, and Capri was inhabited by the Teleboi. Tiberius had by this time filled the island with 12 country houses, each with a grand name and a vast structure of its own. Intent as he had once been on the cares of the state, he was now for thoroughly unbending himself in secret profligacy and a leisure of malignant schemes. For he still retained that rash proneness to suspect and to believe, which even at Rome Sejanus used to foster, and which he here excited more keenly, no longer concealing his machinations against Agrippina and Nero. Soldiers hung about them, and every message, every visit, their public and their private life were, I may say, regularly chronicled. And persons were actually suborned to advise them to flee to the armies of Germany, or, when the forum was most crowded, to clasp the statue of the divine Augustus and appeal to the protection of the people and Senate. These counsels they disdained, but they were charged with having had thoughts of acting on them. The year of the consulship of Silanus and Silius Nerva opened with a foul beginning. A Roman knight of the highest rank, Titius Sabinus, was dragged to prison because he had been a friend of Germanicus. He had, indeed, persisted in showing marked respect towards his wife and children, as their visitor at home, their companion in public, the solitary survivor of so many clients, and he was consequently esteemed by the good, as he was a terror to the evil-minded. Latinius Latierus, Porcius Cato, Petitius Rufus, and Marcus Opsius, ex-praetors, conspired to attack him, with an eye to the consulship, to which there was access only through Sejanus, and the goodwill of Sejanus was to be gained only by crime. They arranged themselves against that Latierus, who had some slight acquaintance with Sabinus, should devise the plot, that the rest should be present as witnesses, and that they should begin the prosecution. Accordingly Latierus, after first dropping some casual remarks, went on to praise the fidelity of Sabinus in not having, like others, forsaken, after its fall, the house of which he had been the friend in its prosperity. He also spoke highly of Germanicus and compassionately of Agrippina. Sabinus, with the natural softness of the human heart under calamity, burst into tears, which he followed up with complaints, and soon with yet more daring invective against Sejanus, against his cruelty, pride, and ambition. He did not spare even Tiberius in his reproaches. That conversation, having united them, as it were, in an unlawful secret, led to a semblance of close intimacy. Henceforward Sabinus himself sought Latierus, went continually to his house, and imparted to him his griefs, as to a most faithful friend. The men whom I have named now consulted how these conversations might fall within the hearing of more persons. It was necessary that the place of meeting should preserve the appearance of secrecy, and if witnesses were to stand behind the doors, there was a fear of their being seen or heard, or of suspicion casually arising. 3 senators thrust themselves into the space between the roof and ceiling, a hiding-place as shameful as the treachery was execrable. They applied their ears to apertures and crevices. Latierus, meanwhile, having met Sabinus in the streets, drew him to his house and to the room, as if he was going to communicate some fresh discoveries. There he talked much about the past and impending troubles, a copious topic indeed, and about fresh horrors. Sabinus spoke as before and at greater length, as sorrow, when once it has broken into utterance, is the harder to restrain. Instantly they hastened to accuse him, and having dispatched a letter to the emperor, they informed him of the order of the plot and of their own infamy. Never was Rome more distracted and terror-stricken. Meetings, conversations, the ear of friend and stranger were alike shunned. Even things mute and lifeless, the very roof and walls, were eyed with suspicion. The emperor, in his letter on the 1st of January, after offering the usual prayers for the new year, referred to Sabinus, whom he reproached with having corrupted some of his freedmen and having attempted his life, and he claimed vengeance in no obscure language. It was decreed without hesitation, and the condemned man was dragged off, exclaiming as loudly as he could, with head covered and throat tightly bound, that this was inaugurating the year, these were the victims slain to Sejanus. Wherever he turned his eyes, wherever his words fell, there was flight and solitude, the streets and public places were forsaken. A few retraced their steps and again showed themselves, shuddering at the mere fact that they had betrayed alarm. What day, they asked, will be without some execution, when, amid sacrifices and prayers, a time when it is usual to refrain even from a profane word, the chain and halter are introduced? Tiberius has not incurred such odium blindly. This is a studied device to make us believe that there is no reason why the new magistrates should not open the dungeons as well as the temple and the altars. Thereupon there came a letter of thanks to them for having punished a foe so bitter to the state, and the emperor farther added that he had an anxious life, that he apprehended treachery from enemies, but he mentioned no one by name. Still there was no question that this was aimed at Nero and Agrippina. But for my plan of referring each event to its own year, I should feel a strong impulse to anticipate matters and at once relate the deaths by which Latinius and Opsius and the other authors of this atrocious deed perished, some after Caius became emperor, some even while Tiberius yet ruled. For although he would not have the instruments of his wickedness destroyed by others, he frequently, when he was tired of them, and fresh ones offered themselves for the same services, flung off the old, now become a mere incubus. But these and other punishments of guilty men I shall describe in due course. Asinius Gallus, to whose children Agrippina was aunt, then moved that the emperor should be requested to disclose his apprehensions to the Senate, and allow their removal. Of all his virtues, as he counted them, there was none on which Tiberius so prided himself as his ability to dissemble, and he was therefore the more irritated at an attempt to expose what he was hiding. Sejanus, however, pacified him, not out of love for Gallus, but rather to wait the result of the emperor's wavering mood, knowing, as he did, though slow in forming his purpose, yet having once broken through his reserve, he would follow up harsh words with terrible deeds. About the same time Julia died, the granddaughter of Augustus. He had condemned her on a conviction of adultery, and had banished her to the island of Trimaris, not far from the shores of Apulia. There she endured a 20 years' exile, in which she was supported by relief from Augusta, who, having overthrown the prosperity of her stepchildren by secret machinations, made open display of her compassion to the fallen family. The same year the Frisi, a nation beyond the Rhine, cast off peace, more because of our rapacity than from their impatience of subjection. Drusus had imposed on them a moderate tribute, suitable to their limited resources, the furnishing of ox hides for military purposes. No one ever severely scrutinized the size or thickness till Olennius, a first-rank centurion, appointed to govern the Frisi, selected hides of wild bulls as the standard according to which they were to be supplied. This would have been hard for any nation, and it was the less tolerable to the Germans, whose forests abound in huge beasts, while their home cattle are undersized. First it was their herds, next their lands, and last the persons of their wives and children, which they gave up to bondage. Then came angry remonstrances, and when they received no relief, they sought a remedy in war. The soldiers appointed to collect the tribute were seized and gibbeted. Olennius anticipated their fury by flight, and found refuge in a fortress, named Flevum, where a by no means contemptible force of Romans and allies kept guard over the shores of the oceans. As soon as this was known to Lucius Apronius, propraetor of Lower Germany, he summoned from the upper province the legionary veterans, as well as some picked auxiliary infantry and cavalry. Instantly conveying both armies down the Rhine, he threw them on the Frisi, raising at once the siege of the fortress and dispelling the rebels in defence of their own possessions. Next he began constructing solid roads and bridges over the neighbouring estuaries for the passage of his heavy troops, and meanwhile, having found a ford, he ordered the cavalry of the Caninifates, with all the German infantry which served with us, to take the enemy in the rear. Already in battle array, they were beating back our auxiliary horse as well as that of the legion sent to support them, when 3 light cohorts, then 2 more, and after a while the entire cavalry were sent to the attack. They were strong enough, had they charged all together, but coming up as they did at intervals, they did not give fresh courage to the repulsed troops, and were themselves carried away in a panic of the fugitives. Apronius entrusted the rest of the auxiliaries to Cathegus Labeo, the commander of the 5th legion, but he too, finding his men's position critical and being in extreme peril, sent messages imploring the whole strength of the legions. The soldiers of the 5th sprang forward, drove back the enemy in a fierce encounter, and saved our cohorts and cavalry, who were exhausted by their wounds. But the Roman general did not attempt vengeance, or even bury the dead, although many tribunes, prefects, and first-rank centurions had fallen. Soon afterwards it was ascertained from deserters that 900 Romans had been cut to pieces in a wood called Braduhennes, after prolonging the fight till the next day, and that another body of 400, which had taken possession of the house of one Cryptorix, once a soldier in our pay, fearing betrayal, had perished by mutual slaughter. The Frisian name thus became famous in Germany, and Tiberius kept our losses a secret, not wishing to entrust any one with the war. Nor did the Senate care whether dishonour fell on the extreme frontiers of the empire. Fear at home had filled their hearts, and for this they sought relief in sycophancy. And so, although their advice was asked on totally different subjects, they decreed an altar to clemency, an altar to friendship, and statues round them to Caesar and Sejanus, both of whom they earnestly begged with repeated entreaties to allow themselves to be seen in public. Still, neither of them would visit Rome or even the neighbourhood of Rome. They thought it enough to quit the island and show themselves on the opposite shores of Campania. Senators, knights, a number of the city populace flocked thither, anxiously looking to Sejanus, approach to whom was particularly difficult, and was consequently sought by intrigue and by complicity in his counsels. It was sufficiently clear that his arrogance was increasing by gazing on this foul and open displayed servility. At Rome, indeed, hurrying crowds are a familiar sight. From the extent of the city no one knows on what business each citizen is bent. But there, as they lounged in promiscuous crowds in the fields or on the shore, they had to bear day and night alike the patronizing smiles and the supercilious insolence of hall porters, till even this was forbidden them, and those whom Sejanus had not deigned to accost or to look on returned to the capital in alarm, while some felt an evil joy, though there hung over them the dreadful doom of that ill-starred friendship. Tiberius, meanwhile, having himself in person bestowed the hand of his granddaughter Agrippina, Germanicus's daughter, on Cneius Domitius, directed the marriage to be celebrated at Rome. In selecting Domitius he looked not only to his ancient lineage, but also to his alliance with the blood of the Caesars, for he could point to Octavia as his grandmother, and through her to Augustus as his great-uncle. End of Book 4.
Book 5 of the Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. The Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus, translated by Alfred John Church and William Jackson Brodrib. Book 5, A.D. 29–31. The Death and Character of Livia. In the consulship of Rubellius and Fufius, both of whom had the surname Geminus, died in an advanced old age Julia Augusta. A Claudia by birth, and by adoption a Livia and a Julia, she united the noblest blood of Rome. Her first marriage, by which she had children, was with Tiberius Nero, who, an exile during the Perusian War, returned to Rome when peace had been concluded between Sextus Pompeius and the Triumvirs. After this, Caesar, enamoured of her beauty, took her away from her husband, whether against her wish is uncertain. So impatient was he that he brought her to his house actually pregnant, not allowing time for her confinement. She had no subsequent issue, but allied as she was through the marriage of Agrippina and Germanicus to the blood of Augustus, her great-grandchildren were also his. In the purity of her home life she was of the ancient type, but was more gracious than was thought fitting in ladies of former days. An imperious mother and an amiable wife, she was a match for the diplomacy of her husband and the dissimulation of her son. Her funeral was simple, and her will long remained unexecuted. Her panegyric was pronounced from the rostra by her great-grandson Caius Caesar, who afterwards succeeded to power. Tiberius, however, making no change in his voluptuous life, excused himself by letter for his absence from his last duty to his mother, on the ground of the pressure of business. He even abridged, out of moderation as it seemed, the honours which the Senate had voted on a lavish scale to her memory, allowing only a very few, and adding that no religious worship was to be decreed, this having been her own wish. In a part of the same letter he sneered at female friendships, with an indirect censure on the consul Fufius, who had risen to distinction through Augustus' partiality. Fufius was indeed a man well fitted to win the affection of a woman. He was witty too, and accustomed to ridicule Tiberius with those bitter jests which the powerful remember so long. This, at all events, was the beginning of an unmitigated and grinding despotism. As long, indeed, as Augusta lived, there yet remained a refuge, for with Tiberius obedience to his mother was the habit of a life, and Sejanus did not dare to set himself above a parent's authority. Now, so to say, they threw off the reins and let loose their fury. A letter was sent, directed against Agrippina and Nero, which was popularly believed to have been long before forwarded, and to have been kept back by Augusta, as it was publicly read soon after her death. It contained expressions of studied harshness, yet it was not armed rebellion or a longing for revolution, but unnatural passions and profligacy, which the emperor imputed to his grandson. Against his daughter-in-law he did not dare to invent this much. He merely censured her insolent tongue and defiant spirit amid the panic-stricken silence of the Senate, till a few who had no hope from merit, and public calamities are ever used by individuals for interested purposes, demanded that the question should be debated. The most eager was Cotta Messallinus, who made a savage speech. Still the other principal senators, and especially the magistrates, were perplexed, for Tiberius, notwithstanding his furious invective, had left everything else in doubt. There was in the Senate one Junius Rusticus, who, having been appointed by the emperor to register its debates, was therefore supposed to have an insight into his secret purposes. This man, whether through some fatal impulse — he had indeed never before given any evidence of courage — or a misdirected acuteness, which made him tremble at the uncertain future, while he forgot impending perils, attached himself to the waverers, and warned the consuls not to enter on the debate. He argued that the highest issues turned on trivial causes, and that the fall of the house of Germanicus might one day move the old man's remorse. At the same moment the people, bearing the images of Agrippina and Nero, thronged round the Senate house, and, with words of blessing on the emperor, kept shouting that the letter was a forgery, and that it was not by the prince's will that ruin was being plotted against his house. and so that day passed without any dreadful result. Fictitious speeches, too, against Sejanus were published under the names of ex-consuls, for several persons indulged, all the more recklessly because anonymously, the caprice of their imaginations. Consequently, the wrath of Sejanus was the more furious, and he had ground for alleging that the Senate disregarded the emperor's trouble, that the people were in revolt, that speeches in a new style and new resolutions were being heard and read. What remained but to take the sword and choose for their generals and emperors those whose images they had followed as standards? Upon this the emperor, after repeating his invectives against his grandson and his daughter-in-law, and reprimanding the populace in an edict, complained to the Senate that by the trick of one senator the imperial dignity had been publicly flouted, and he insisted that, after all, the whole matter should be left to his exclusive decision. Without further deliberation they proceeded, not indeed to pronounce the final sentence, for this was forbidden, but to declare that they were prepared for vengeance, and were restrained only by the strong hand of the sovereign. Note: the remainder of the 5th book and the beginning of the 6th, recounting Sejanus' marriage and fall, and covering a space of nearly 3 years, are lost. Newer editions of Tacitus mark the division between the 5th and 6th books at this point, rather than at the end of section 11, but references are regularly made to the older numbering, and so it has been retained here. The beginning of the next section, section 6, is obviously fragmentary. End of note. 44 speeches were delivered on this subject, a few of which were prompted by fear, most by the habit of flattery. There is now a change of fortune, and even he who chose Sejanus to be his colleague and his son-in-law excuses his error. As for the rest, the man whom they encouraged by shameful baseness, they now wickedly revile. Which is the most pitiable, to be accused for friendship's sake, or to have to accuse a friend, I cannot decide. I will not put any man's cruelty or compassion to the test, but while I am free and have a clear conscience, I will anticipate peril. I implore you to cherish my memory with joy rather than with sorrow, numbering me too with those who by noble death have fled from the miseries of our country. Then, detaining those of his friends who were minded to stay with him and converse, or, if otherwise, dismissing them, he thus spent part of the day, and with a numerous circle yet round him, all gazing on his fearless face, and imagining that there was still time to elapse before the last scene, he fell on a sword which he had concealed in his robe. The emperor did not pursue him after his death with either accusation or reproach, although he had heaped a number of foul charges on Blsesus. Next were discussed the cases of Publius Vitellius and Pomponius Secundus. The first was charged by his accusers with having offered the keys of the treasury, of which he was prefect, and the military chest in aid of a revolution. Against the latter, Considius, an ex-praetor, alleged intimacy with Aelius Gallus, who, after the punishment of Sejanus, had fled to the gardens of Pomponius as his safest refuge. They had no resource in their peril, but in the courageous firmness of their brothers, who became their sureties. Soon, after several adjournments, Vitellius, weary alike of hope and fear, asked for a penknife, avowedly for his literary pursuits, and inflicted a slight wound in his veins, and died at last of a broken heart. Pomponius, a man of refined manners and brilliant genius, bore his adverse fortune with resignation, and outlived Tiberius. It was next decided to punish the remaining children of Sejanus, though the fury of the populace was subsiding, and people generally had been appeased by the previous executions. Accordingly they were carried off to prison, the boy, aware of his impending doom, and the little girl, who was so unconscious that she continually asked what was her offence, and whither she was being dragged, saying that she would do so no more, and a childish chastisement was enough for her correction. Historians of the time tell us that, as there was no precedent for the capital punishment of a virgin, she was violated by the executioner with the rope on her neck. Then they were strangled, and their bodies, mere children as they were flung down the Gemonii. About the same time, Asia and Achaia were alarmed by a prevalent but short-lived rumour that Drusus, the son of Germanicus, had been seen in the Cyclades, and subsequently on the mainland. There was indeed a young man of much the same age, whom some of the emperor's freedmen pretended to recognize, and to whom they attached themselves with a treacherous intent. The renown of the name attracted the ignorant, and the Greek mind eagerly fastens on what is new and marvellous. The story, indeed, which they no sooner invented than believed, was that Drusus had escaped from custody, and was on his way to the armies of his father with the design of invading Egypt or Syria. And he was now drawing to himself a multitude of young men and much popular enthusiasm, enjoying the present and cherishing idle hopes of the future, when Publius Sabinus heard of the affair. At the time he was chiefly occupied with Macedonia, but he also had the charge of Achaia. So, to forestall the danger, let the story be true or false, he hurried by the bays of Torone and Thermi, then passed on to Euboea, an island of the Aegean, to Piraeus on the coast of Attica, thence to the shores of Corinth and the narrow isthmus, and having arrived by the other sea at Nicopolis, a Roman colony, he there at last ascertained that the man, when skilfully questioned, had said that he was the son of Marcus Silanus, and that after the dispersion of a number of his followers he had embarked on a vessel, intending, it seemed, to go to Italy. Sabinus sent this account to Tiberius, and of the origin and issue of the affair nothing more is known to me. At the close of the year a long-growing feud between the consuls broke out. Trio, a reckless man in incurring enmities and a practised lawyer, had indirectly censured Regulus as having been half-hearted in crushing the satellites of Sejanus. Regulus, who, unless he was provoked, loved quietness, not only repulsed his colleague's attack, but was for dragging him to trial as a guilty accomplice in the conspiracy. And though many of the senators implored them to compose a quarrel likely to end fatally, they continued their enmity and their mutual menaces till they retired from office. End of the extant portion of Books 5 and 6. Recording by Graham Redman.
Book 6, Part 1 of the Annals, by Publius Cornelius Tacitus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Annals, by Publius Cornelius Tacitus, translated by Alfred John Church and William Jackson Brodribb. Book 6, A.D. 32 to 37. Part 1. Tiberius at Capreae. Cneius Domitius and Camillus Scribonianus had entered on the consulship, when the emperor, after crossing the channel which divides Capreae from Surrentum, sailed along Campania, in doubt whether he should enter Rome, or possibly simulating the intention of going thither, because he had resolved otherwise. He often landed at points in the neighbourhood, visited the gardens by the Tiber, but went back to the cliffs and to the solitude of the sea-shores, in shame at the vices and profligacies into which he had plunged so unrestrainedly that, in the fashion of a despot, he debauched the children of free-born citizens. It was not merely beauty and a handsome person which he felt as an incentive to his lust, but the modesty of childhood in some, and noble ancestry in others. Hitherto unknown terms were then for the first time invented, derived from the abominations of the place, and the endless phases of sensuality. Slaves, too, were set over the work of seeking out and procuring, with rewards for the willing, and threats to the reluctant, and if there was resistance from a relative or a parent, they used violence and force, and actually indulged their own passions, as if dealing with captives. At Rome, meanwhile, in the beginning of the year, as if Livia's crimes had just been discovered, and not also long ago punished, terrible decrees were proposed against her very statues and memory, and the property of Sejanus was to be taken from the exchequer and transferred to the imperial treasury, as if there was any difference. The motion was being urged with extreme persistency, in almost the same, or with but slightly changed language, by such men as Scipio, Silanus, and Cassius, when suddenly Togonius Gallus, intruding his own obscurity among illustrious names, was heard with ridicule. He begged the emperor to select a number of senators, 20 out of whom should be chosen by lot to wear swords and to defend his person whenever he entered the Senate house. The man had actually believed a letter from him, in which he asked the protection of one of the consuls, so that he might go in safety from Capreae to Rome. Tiberius, however, who usually combined jesting and seriousness, thanked the senators for their good will, but asked who could be rejected, who could be chosen. Were they always to be the same, or was there to be a succession? Were they to be men who had held office, or youths, private citizens, or officials? Then again, what a scene would be presented by persons grasping their swords on the threshold of the Senate house! His life was not of so much worth, if it had to be defended by arms. This was his answer to Togonius, guarded in its expression, and he urged nothing beyond the rejection of the motion. Junius Gallio, however, who had proposed that the praetorian soldiers, after having served their campaigns, should acquire the privilege of sitting in the 14 rows of the theatre, received a savage censure. Tiberius, just as if he were face to face with him, asked what he had to do with the soldiers, who ought to receive the emperor's orders, or his rewards, except from the emperor himself. He had really discovered something which the divine Augustus had not foreseen. Or was not one of Sejanus's satellites rather seeking to sow discord and sedition as a means of prompting ignorant minds, under the pretence of compliment, to ruin military discipline? This was Gallio's recompense for his carefully prepared flattery, with immediate expulsion from the Senate and then from Italy. And as men complained that he would endure his exile with equanimity, since he had chosen the famous and lovely island of Lesbos, he was dragged back to Rome and confined in the houses of different officials. The emperor, in the same letter, crushed Sextus Paconianus, an ex-praetor, to the great joy of the senators, as he was a daring, mischievous man, who pried into every person's secrets, and had been the chosen instrument of Sejanus in his treacherous designs against Caius Caesar. When this fact was divulged, there came an outburst of long-concealed hatreds, and there must have been a sentence of capital punishment, had he not himself volunteered a disclosure. As soon as he named Latinius Latiaris, accuser and accused, both alike objects of execration, presented a most welcome spectacle. Latiaris, as I have related, had been foremost in contriving the ruin of Titius Sabinus, and was now the first to pay the penalty. By way of episode, Haterius Agrippa inveighed against the consuls of the previous year for now sitting silent after their threats of impeaching one another. "It must be fear," he said, "and not a guilty conscience, which are acting as a bond of union. But the senators must not keep back what they have heard." Regulus replied that he was awaiting the opportunity for vengeance, and meant to press it in the emperor's presence. Trio's answer was that it was best to efface the memory of rivalries between colleagues, and of any words uttered in quarrels. When Agrippa still persisted, Sanguinius Maximus, one of the ex-consuls, implored the Senate not to increase the emperor's personal anxieties by seeking further occasions of bitterness, as he was himself competent to provide remedies. This secured the safety of Regulus, and the postponement of Trio's ruin. Haterius was hated all the more. One with untimely slumbers and nights of riot, and not fearing in his indolence even the cruellest of princes, he yet plotted amid his gluttony and lust the destruction of illustrious men. Several charges were next brought, as soon as the opportunity offered, against Cotta Messallinus, the author of every unusually cruel proposal, and consequently regarded with inveterate hatred. He had spoken, it was said, of Caius Caesar as if it were a question whether he was a man, and of an entertainment at which he was present on Augustus' birthday with the priests, as a funeral banquet. In remonstrating, too, against the influence of Marcus Lepidus and Lucius Aruntius, with whom he had disputes on many matters, he had added the remark, "They will have the Senate's support, I shall have that of my darling Tiberius." But the leading men of the state failed to convict him on all the charges. When they pressed the case, he appealed to the emperor. Soon afterwards a letter arrived, in which Tiberius traced the origin of the friendship between himself and Cotta, enumerated his frequent services, and then requested that words perversely misrepresented and the freedom of table talk might not be construed into a crime. The beginning of the emperor's letter seemed very striking. It opened thus: "May all the gods and goddesses destroy me more miserably than I feel myself to be daily perishing, if I know at this moment what to write to you, senators, how to write it, or what, in short, not to write." So completely had his crimes and infamies recoiled, as a penalty, on himself. With profound meaning was it often affirmed by the greatest teacher of philosophy that, could the minds of tyrants be laid bare, there would be seen gashes and wounds, for, as the body is lacerated by scourging, so is the spirit by brutality, by lust, and by evil thoughts. Assuredly, Tiberius was not saved by his elevation or his solitude from having to confess the anguish of his heart and his self-inflicted punishment. Authority was then given to the Senate to decide the case of Caecilianus, one of its members, the chief witness against Cotta, and it was agreed that the same penalty should be inflicted as on Ariseus and Sanguinius, the accusers of Lucius Aruntius. Nothing ever happened to Cotta more to his distinction. Of noble birth, but beggared by extravagance and infamous for his excesses, he was now, by dignity of his revenge, raised to a level with the stainless virtues of Aruntius. Quintus Servius and Minucius Thermus were next arraigned. Servius was an ex-praetor, and had formerly been a companion of Germanicus. Minucius was of equestrian rank, and both had enjoyed, though discreetly, the friendship of Sejanus. Hence they were the more pitied. Tiberius, on the contrary, denounced them as foremost in crime, and bade Caius Cestius the elder tell the Senate what he had communicated to the emperor by letter. Cestius undertook the prosecution. And this was the most dreadful feature of the age. that leading members of the Senate, some openly, some secretly, employed themselves in the very lowest work of the informer. One could not distinguish between aliens and kinsfolk, between friends and strangers, or say what was quite recent or what half forgotten from lapse of time. People were incriminated for some casual remark in the forum or at the dinner-table, for everyone was impatient to be the first to mark his victim, some to screen themselves most from being, as it were, infected with the contagion of the malady. Minucius and Servius, on being condemned, went over to the prosecution, and then Julius Africanus with Seius Quadratus were dragged into the same ruin. Africanus was from the Santones, one of the states of Gaul. The origin of Quadratus I have not ascertained. Many authors, I am well aware, have passed over the perils and punishments of a host of persons, sickened by the multiplicity of them, or fearing that what they had themselves found wearisome and saddening would be equally fatiguing to their readers. For myself, I have lighted on many facts worth knowing, though other writers have not recorded them. A Roman knight, Marcus Terentius, at the crisis when all others had hypocritically repudiated the friendship of Sejanus, dared, when impeached on that ground, to cling to it by the following avowal to the Senate. In my position it is perhaps less to my advantage to acknowledge than to deny the charge. Still, whatever is to be the issue of the matter, I shall admit that I was the friend of Sejanus, that I anxiously sought to be such, and was delighted when I was successful. I had seen him, his father's colleague in the command of the Praetorian cohorts, and subsequently combining the duties of civil and military life. His kinsfolk and connections were loaded with honours. Intimacy with Sejanus was in every case a powerful recommendation to the emperor's friendship. Those, on the contrary, whom he hated, had to struggle with danger and humiliation. I take no individual as an instance. All of us who had no part in his last design I mean to defend at the peril of myself alone. It was really not Sejanus of Volsny. It was a member of the Claudian and Julian houses, in which he had taken up a position by his marriage alliance. It was your son-in-law, Caesar, your partner in the consulship, the man who administered your political functions, whom we courted. It is not for us to criticize one whom you may raise above all others, or your motives for so doing. Heaven has entrusted you with the supreme decision of affairs, and for us is left the glory of obedience. And again, we see what takes place before our eyes, who it is on whom you bestow riches and honours, who are the most powerful to help or to injure. That Sejanus was such, no one will deny. To explore the prince's secret thoughts, or any of his hidden plans, is a forbidden, a dangerous thing, nor does it follow that one could reach them. Do not, senators, think only of Sejanus's last day, but of his 16 years of power. We actually adored a Satrius and a Pomponius. To be known even to his freedmen and hall porters was thought something very grand. What then is my meaning? Is this apology meant to be offered for all without difference and discrimination? No. It is to be restricted within proper limits. Let plots against the state, murderous designs against the emperor be punished. As for friendship and its obligations, the same principle must acquit both you, Caesar, and us. The courage of this speech, and the fact that there had been found a man to speak out what was in all people's thoughts, had such an effect that the accusers of Terentius were sentenced to banishment or death, their previous offences being taken into account. Then came a letter from Tiberius against Sextus Vestilius, an ex-praetor whom, as a special favourite of his brother Drusus, the emperor had admitted into his own select circle. His reason for being displeased with Vestilius was that he had either written an attack on Caius Caesar as a profligate, or that Tiberius believed a false charge. For this Vestilius was excluded from the prince's table. He then tried the knife with his aged hand, but again bound up his veins, opening them once more, however, on having begged for pardon by letter and received a pitiless answer. After him a host of persons were charged with treason. Annius Pollio, Appius Silenus, Scaurus Mamercus, Sabinus Calvisius, Vincianus too, coupled with Pollio his father, men all of illustrious descent, some too of the highest political distinction. The senators were panic-stricken, for how few of their number were not connected by alliance or by friendship with this multitude of men of rank. Celsus, however, tribune of a city cohort, and now one of the prosecutors, saved Appius and Calvisius from the peril. The emperor postponed the cases of Pollio, Vinicianus, and Scaurus, intending to try them himself with the Senate, not, however, without affixing some ominous marks to the name of Scaurus. Even women were not exempt from danger. Where they could not be accused of grasping at political power, their tears were made a crime. Vitia, an aged woman, mother of Fufius Geminus, was executed for bewailing the death of her son. Such were the proceedings in the Senate. It was the same with the emperor. Vescularius Atticus and Julius Marinus were hurried off to execution, two of his oldest friends, men who had followed him to Rhodes and been his inseparable companions at Capreae. Vescularius was his agent in the plot against Libo, and it was with the cooperation of Marinus that Sejanus had ruined Curtius Atticus. Hence there was all the more joy at the recoil of these precedents on their authors. About the same time, Lucius Piso, the pontiff, died a natural death, a rare incident in so high a rank. Never had he by choice proposed a servile motion, and, whenever necessity was too strong for him, he would suggest judicious compromises. His father, as I have related, had been a censor. He lived to the advanced age of 80, and had won in Thrace the honour of a triumph. But his chief glory rested on the wonderful tact with which, as city prefect, he handled an authority recently made perpetual, and all the more galling to men unaccustomed to obey it. In former days, when the kings, and subsequently the chief magistrates, went from Rome, an official was temporarily chosen to administer justice and provide for emergencies, so that the capital might not be left without government. It is said that Denter Romulius was appointed by Romulus, then Numa Marcius by Tullus Hostilius, and Spurius Lucretius by Tarquinius Superbus. Afterwards the consuls made the appointment. The shadow of the old practice still survives, whenever, in consequence of the Latin festival, someone is deputed to exercise the consul's functions. And Augustus, too, during the civil wars, gave Cilnius Maecenas, a Roman knight, charge of everything in Rome and Italy. When he rose to supreme power, in consideration of the magnitude of the state and the slowness of legal remedies, he selected one of the ex-consuls to overawe the slaves, and that part of the population which, unless it fears a strong hand, is disorderly and reckless. Messala Corvinus was the first to obtain the office, which he lost within a few days, as not knowing how to discharge it. After him, Taurus Statilius, though in advanced years, sustained it admirably, and then Piso, after 20 years of similar credit, was, by the Senate's decree, honoured with a public funeral. A motion was next brought forward in the Senate by Quintilianus, a tribune of the people, respecting an alleged book of the Sibyl. Caninius Gallus, a book of the College of the 15, had asked that it might be received among the other volumes of the same prophetess by a decree on the subject. This having been carried by a division, the emperor sent a letter in which he gently censured the tribune as ignorant of the ancient usage because of his youth. Gallus he scolded for having introduced the matter in a thin senate, notwithstanding his long experience in the science of religious ceremonies, without taking the opinion of the college, or having the verses read and criticised, as was usual, by its presidents, though their authenticity was very doubtful. He also reminded him that, as many spurious productions were current under a celebrated name, Augustus had prescribed a day within which they should be deposited with the city praetor, and after which it should not be lawful for any private person to hold them. The same regulations, too, had been made by our ancestors after the burning of the Capitol in the Social War, when there was a search throughout Samos, Ilium, Erythrae, and even in Africa, Sicily, and the Italian colonies for the verses of the Sibyl, whether there were but one or more, and the priests were charged with the business of distinguishing, as far as they could by human means, what were genuine. Accordingly, the book in question was now also submitted to the scrutiny of the College of the 15. During the same consulship, a high price of corn almost brought on an insurrection. For several days there were many clamorous demands made in the theatre with an unusual freedom of language towards the emperor. This provoked him to censure the magistrates and the Senate for not having used the authority of the state to put down the people. He named, too, the corn-supplying provinces, and dwelt on the far larger amount of grain imported by himself than by Augustus. So the Senate drew up a decree in the severe spirit of antiquity, and the consuls issued a not less stringent proclamation. The emperor's silence was not, as he had hoped, taken as a proof of patriotism, but of pride. At the year's close, Geminius, Celsus, and Pompeius, Roman knights, fell beneath a charge of conspiracy. Of these, Caius Geminius, by lavish expenditure and a luxurious life, had been a friend of Sejanus, but with no serious result. Julius Celsus, a tribune, while in confinement, loosened his chain, and, having twisted it round him, broke his neck by throwing himself in an opposite direction. Rubrius Fabatus was put under surveillance on a suspicion that, in despair of the fortunes of Rome, he meant to throw himself on the mercy of the Parthians. He was, at any rate, found near the straits of the Sicily, and when dragged back by a centurion he assigned no adequate reason for his long journey. Still, he lived on in safety, thanks to forgetfulness rather than to mercy. In the consulship of Servius Galba and Lucius Sulla, the emperor, after having long considered whom he was to choose to be husbands for his granddaughters, now that the maidens were of marriageable age, selected Lucius Cassius and Marcus Vinicius. Vinicius was of provincial descent. He was born at Cales, his father and grandfather having been consuls, and his family, on the other side, being of the rank of knights. He was a man of amiable temper and of cultivated eloquence. Cassius was of an ancient and honourable, though plebeian, house at Rome. Though he was brought up by his father under a severe training, he won esteem more frequently by his good nature than by his diligence. To him, and to Vinicius, the emperor married respectively Drusilla and Julia, Germanicus's daughters, and addressed a letter on the subject to the Senate, with a slightly complimentary mention of the young men. He next assigned some very vague reasons for his absence, then passed to more important matters, the ill will against him originating in his state policy, and requested that Macro, who commanded the praetorians, with a few tribunes and centurions, might accompany him whenever he entered the Senate house. But, though a decree was voted by the Senate on a liberal scale, and without any restrictions as to rank or numbers, he never so much as went near the walls of Rome, much less the state council, for he would often go round and avoid his native city by circuitous routes. Meanwhile, a powerful host of accusers fell with sudden fury on the class which systematically increased its wealth by usury, in defiance of a law passed by Caesar the Dictator, defining the terms of lending money and of holding estates in Italy, a law long obsolete because the public good is sacrificed to private interest. The curse of usury was indeed of old standing in Rome, and a most frequent cause of sedition and discord, and it was therefore repressed even in the early days of a less corrupt morality. First, the 12 tables prohibited anyone from exacting more than 10%, when previously the rate had depended upon the caprice of the wealthy. Subsequently, by a bill brought in by the tribunes, interest was reduced to half that amount, and finally compound interest was wholly forbidden. A check, too, was put by several enactments of the people on evasions which, though continually put down, still, through strange artifices, reappeared. On this occasion, however, Gracchus, the praetor, to whose jurisdiction the inquiry had fallen, felt himself compelled by the number of persons endangered to refer the matter to the Senate. In their dismay, the senators, not one of whom was free from similar guilt, threw themselves on the emperor's indulgence. He yielded, and 1 year and 6 months were granted, within which every one was to settle his private accounts conformably to the requirements of the law. Hence followed a scarcity of money, a great shock being given to all credit. The current coin, too, in consequence of the conviction of so many persons and the sale of their property, being locked up in the imperial treasury or the public exchequer. To meet this, the Senate had directed that every creditor should have 2/3 his capital secured on estates in Italy. Creditors, however, were suing for payment in full, and it was not respectable for persons, when sued, to break faith. So, at first, there were clamorous meetings and importunate entreaties, then noisy applications to the praetor's court, and the very device intended as a remedy, the sale and purchase of estates, proved the contrary, as the usurers had hoarded up all their money for buying land. The facilities for selling were followed by a fall of prices, and the deeper a man was in debt, the more reluctantly did he part with his property, and many were utterly ruined. The destruction of private wealth precipitated the fall of rank and reputation, till at last the emperor interposed his aid by distributing throughout the banks 100 million sesterces, and allowing freedom to borrow without interest for 3 years, provided the borrower gave security to the state in land to double the amount. Credit was thus restored, and gradually private lenders were found. The purchase, too, of estates was not carried out according to the letter of the Senate's decree, rigour at the outset, as usual with such matters, becoming negligence in the end. Former alarms then returned, as there was a charge of treason against Considius Proculus. While he was celebrating his birthday without a fear, he was hurried before the Senate, condemned, and instantly put to death. His sister Sancia was outlawed, on the accusation of Quintus Pomponius, a restless spirit who pretended that he employed himself in this and like practices to win favour with the sovereign, and thereby alleviate the perils hanging over his brother Pomponius Secundus. Pompeia Macrina, too, was sentenced to banishment. Her husband Argolicus and her father-in-law Laco, leading men of Achaia, had been ruined by the emperor. Her father, likewise an illustrious Roman knight, and her brother, an ex-praetor, seeing their doom was near, destroyed themselves. It was imputed to them as a crime that their great-grandfather, Theophanes of Mytilene, had been one of the intimate friends of Pompey the Great, and that after his death Greek flattery had paid him divine honours. Sextus Marius, the richest man in Spain, was next accused of incest with his daughter, and thrown headlong from the Tarpeian rock. To remove any doubt that the vastness of his wealth had proved the man's ruin, Tiberius kept his gold mines for himself, though they were forfeited to the state. Executions were now a stimulus to his fury, and he ordered the death of all who were lying in prison under accusation of complicity with Sejanus. There lay, singly or in heaps, the unnumbered dead, of every age and sex, the illustrious with the obscure. Kinfolk and friends were not allowed to be near them, to weep over them, or even to gaze on them too long. Spies were set round them, who noted the sorrow of each mourner, and followed the rotting corpses till they were dragged to the Tiber, where, floating or driven on the bank, no one dared to burn or to touch them. The force of terror had utterly extinguished the sense of human fellowship, and, with the growth of cruelty, pity was thrust aside. End of Book 6, Part 1.
Book 6, Part 2 of the Works of Tacitus, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalinda. The Works of Tacitus, Volume 2. Translated, edited, and with essays by Thomas Gordon. Book 6, A.D. 32 to 37, Part 2. Tiberius and Caligula. About the same time, Claudia, daughter to Marcus Silanus, was given in marriage to Caligula, who had accompanied his grandfather to Caprea, having always hid, under a subdolous guise of modesty, his savage and inhuman spirit. Even upon the condemnation of his mother, even for the exile of his brothers, not a word escaped him, not a sigh nor groan. He was so blindly observant of Tiberius that he studied the bent of his temper and seemed to possess it, practised his looks, imitated the change and fashion of his dress, and affected his words and manner of expression. Hence the observation of Passienus, the orator, grew afterwards famous, that there never lived a better slave, nor a worse master. Neither would I omit the presage of Tiberius concerning Galba, then consul. Having sent for him, and sifted him upon several subjects, he at last told him, in Greek, "And thou, Galba, shalt hereafter taste of empire," signifying his late and short sovereignty. Then he uttered from his skill in astrology, which at Rhodes he had leisure to learn, and had Thrasyllus for his teacher, whose capacity he proved by this following trial. As often as he consulted this way concerning any affair, he retired to the roof of the house, attended by one freedman trusted with the secret. This man, strong of body but destitute of letters, guided along the astrologer, whose art Tiberius meant to try, over solitary precipices, for upon a rock the house stood, and as he returned, if any suspicion arose that his predictions were vain, or that the author designed fraud, cast him headlong into the sea, to prevent his making discoveries. Thrasyllus being therefore led over the same rocks, and minutely consulted, his answers were full, and struck Tiberius, as approaching empire and many future revolutions were specifically foretold him. The artist was then questioned, whether he had calculated his own nativity, and thence presaged what was to befall him that same year, nay, that very day. Thrasyllus, surveying the positions of the stars, and calculating their aspects, began at first to hesitate, then to quake, and the more he meditated, being more and more dismayed with wonder and dread, he at last cried out that over him just then hung a boding danger and well nigh fatal. Forthwith Tiberius embraced him, congratulated him upon his foresight of perils and his security from them, and esteeming his predictions as so many oracles, held him thenceforward in the rank of his most intimate friends. For myself, while I listen to these and the like relations, my judgment wavers, whether things human are in their course and rotation determined by fate and immutable necessity, or left to roll at random. For upon this subject the wisest of the ancients, and those addicted to their sects, are of opposite sentiments. Many are of opinion that to the gods neither the generation of us men, nor our death, and in truth neither men nor the actions of men, are of any importance or concernment, and thence such numberless calamities afflict the upright, while pleasure and prosperity surround the wicked. Others hold the contrary position, and believe a fate to preside over events, a fate, however, not resulting from wandering stars, but coeval with the first principles of things, and operating by the continued connection of natural causes. Yet their philosophy leaves out course of life in our own free option, but that after the choice is made, the chain of consequences is inevitable. Neither is that good or evil which passes for such in the estimation of the vulgar. Many who seem wounded with adversity are yet happy. Numbers that wallow in wealth are yet most wretched, since the first often bear with magnanimity the blows of fortune, and the latter abuse her bounty in baneful pursuits. For the rest, it is common to multitudes of men to have each their whole future fortunes determined from the moment of their birth, or if some events thwart the prediction, it is through the mistakes of such as pronounce at random, and thence debase the credit of an art, which, both in ages past and our own, hath given signal instances of its certainty. For, to avoid lengthening this discussion, I shall remember in its order, how, by the son of this same Thrasyllus, the empire was predicted to Nero. During the same consulship was divulged the death of Asinius Gallus. That he perished through famine was undoubted, but whether of his own accord or by constraint was held uncertain. The pleasure of the emperor being consulted, whether he would suffer him to be buried, he was not ashamed to grant such a piece of mock mercy, nor even to blame the anticipations of casualty, which had withdrawn the criminal before he was publicly convicted, as if during 3 intermediate years between his accusation and his death there wanted time for the trial of an ancient consular, and the father of so many consulars. Next perished Drusus, condemned by his grandfather to be starved, but by gnawing the weeds upon which he lay, he by that miserable nourishment protracted life the space of 9 days. Some authors relate that in case Sejanus had resisted and taken arms, Macro had instructions to draw the young man out of confinement, for he was kept in the palace, and set him at the head of the people. Afterwards, because a report ran that the emperor was about to be reconciled to his daughter-in-law and grandson, he chose rather to gratify himself by cruelty than the public by relenting. Tiberius, not satiated with the death of Drusus, even after death pursued him with cruel invectives, and, in a letter to the Senate, charged him with a body foul with prostitution, with a spirit breathing destruction to his own family, and rage against the republic, and ordered to be recited the minutes of his words and actions which had been long and daily registered. A proceeding more black with horror could not be devised. That for so many years there should be those expressly appointed who were to note down his looks, his groans, his secret and extorted murmurs, that his grandfather should delight to hear the treacherous detail, to read it, and to the public expose it, would appear a series of fraud, meanness, and amazement, beyond all measure of faith, were it not for the letters of Actius the centurion, and Didymus the freedman, who in them declare, particularly, the names of the slaves set purposely to abuse and provoke Drusus, with the several parts they acted, how one struck him going out of his chamber, and how another filled him with terrors and dismay. The centurion too repeated, as matter of glory, his own language to Drusus, full of outrage and barbarity, with the words uttered by him under the agonies of famine, that at first, feigning disorder of spirit, he ventured, in the style of a madman, dismal denunciations against Tiberius. But after all hopes of life had forsaken him, then, in steady and deliberate imprecations, he invoked the direful vengeance of the gods, that, as he had slaughtered his son's wife, slaughtered the son of his brother, and his son's sons, and with slaughters had filled the whole house, so they would, in justice to the ancestors of the slain, in justice to their posterity, doom him to the dreadful penalties of so many murders. The senators, in truth, upon this raised a mighty din, under colour of detesting these imprecations. But it was dread which possessed them, and amazement, that he who had once been so dark in the practice of wickedness, and so subtle in the concealment of his bloody spirit, was arrived at such an utter insensibility of shame, that he could thus remove, as it were, the covert of the walls, and represent his own grandson under the ignominious chastisement of a centurion, torn by the barbarous stripes of slaves, and imploring in vain the last sustenance of life. Before the impressions of this grief were worn away, the death of Agrippina was published. I suppose she had lived thus long upon the hopes which from the execution of Sejanus she had conceived. But, feeling afterwards no relaxation of cruelty, death grew her choice. Unless perhaps she were bereaved of nourishment, and her decease feigned to have been of her own seeking. For Tiberius raged against her with abominable imputations, reproaching her with lewdness as the adulteress of Asinius Gallus, and that upon his death she became weary of life. But these were none of her crimes. Agrippina, impatient of an equal lot, and eager for rule, had thence sacrificed to masculine ambition all the passions and vices of women. The emperor added that she departed the same day on which Sejanus had suffered as a traitor 2 years before, and that the same ought to be perpetuated by a public memorial. Nay, he boasted of his clemency, in that she had not been strangled, and her body cast into the charnel of malefactors. For this, as for an instance of mercy, the Senate solemnly thanked him, and decreed that on the 17th of October, the day of both their deaths, a yearly offering should be consecrated to Jupiter for ever. Not long after, Cocceius Nerva, in full prosperity of fortune, in perfect vigour of body, formed a purpose of dying. As he was the incessant companion of the prince, and accomplished in the knowledge of all laws, divine and human, Tiberius, having learned his design, was earnest to dissuade him, examined his motives, joined entreaties, and even declared how grievous to his own spirit it would prove, how grievous to his reputation, if the nearest of his friends should relinquish life, without any cause for dying. Nerva rejected his reasoning, and completed his purpose by abstinence. It was alleged by such as knew his thoughts, that the more he saw into the dreadful source and the increase of public miseries, the more, transported with indignation and fear, he resolved to make an honest end, in the bloom of his integrity, before his life and credit were assaulted. Moreover, the fall of Agrippina, by a reverse hardly credible, procured that of Plancina. She was formerly married to Cnaeus Piso, and though she exulted publicly for the death of Germanicus, yet, when Piso fell, she was protected by the solicitations of Augusta, nor less by the known animosity of Agrippina. But as favour and hate were now withdrawn, justice prevailed, and being questioned for crimes long since sufficiently manifest, she executed with her own hand that vengeance which was rather too slow than too severe. While the city yet bewailed so many tragical deaths, it was an accession to the public affliction that Julia, the daughter of Drusus, and lately the wife of Nero, was espoused to Rubellius Blandus, whose grandfather was remembered by many to have been only a Roman knight from Tibur. At the issue of the year happened the death of Aelius Lamia, and was celebrated with a public funeral. For his last employment he was governor of Rome, having been at length discharged from the mock administration of Syria, which he was never suffered to visit. In his descent he was noble, enjoyed a lively old age, and upon his character was derived fresh glory from the withholding of his province from him. As Pomponius Flaccus, propraetor of Syria, died some time after, there arrived letters from Tiberius. In them he complained that all the senators of distinguished name and qualified to command armies refused that office. Hence he was reduced to the necessity of entreaties, to engage some of the consulars to undertake the rule of provinces. He thought fit to forget Aruntius, governor of Spain, already for 10 years detained at Rome. The same year also died Marcus Lepidus, of whose wisdom and moderation I have in the former books inserted abundant instances. Nor does it require more room here to display his nobility, since his race was that of Aemilii, a race fertile in good citizens, and even those of the same family who lapsed into corruption continued still to be distinguished by their illustrious dignities and fortune. In the consulship of Paulus Fabius and Lucius Vitellius, after a long vicissitude of ages, the phoenix arrived in Egypt, and furnished the most learned of the natives and Greeks with matter of large and various observations concerning that miraculous bird. The circumstances in which they agree, with many others, that however disputed deserve to be known, claim a recital here. That it is a creature sacred to the sun, and in the fashion of its head and diversity of feathers distinct from other birds, all who have described its figure are agreed. About the length of its life relations vary. It is by the vulgar tradition fixed at 500 years, but there are those who extend it to 1461, and assert that the 3 former phoenixes appeared in reigns greatly distant, the first under Sesostris, the next under Amasis, and that one was seen under Ptolemy the 3rd king of Egypt of the Macedonian race, and flew to the city of Heliopolis, accompanied by a vast host of other birds gazing upon the wonderful stranger. But these are, in truth, the obscure accounts of antiquity. Between Ptolemy and Tiberius the interval was shorter, not 250 years. Hence some have believed that the present was a spurious phoenix, and derived not its origin from the territories of Arabia, since it observed nothing of the instinct which ancient tradition attributes to the genuine. for that the latter, having completed its course of years, just before its death builds a nest in its native land, and upon it sheds a generative power, from whence arises a young one, whose first care, when he is grown, is to bury his father. Neither does he undertake it unadvisedly, but by collecting and fetching loads of myrrh, tries his strength in great journeys, and as soon as he finds himself equal to the burden, and fit for the long flight, he rears upon his back his father's body, carries it quite to the altar of the sun, and then flies away. These are uncertain tales, and their uncertainty heightened by fables, but that this bird has been sometimes seen in Egypt is not questioned. At Rome, as the course of slaughter continued unrelenting, Pomponius Labeo, whom I have remembered to have been governor of Mosea, chose, by opening his veins, to let out his own blood, as, by his example, did his wife Paxia hers. Such efficacy had the terror of falling by the executioner, that to escape him, deaths of this sort were readily undergone. Besides, that they who stayed to be sentenced forfeited their estates with their lives, and were debarred the rights of burial. Of such, on the contrary, as anticipated condemnation, the bodies were interred, and their wills remained in force. The motive this, and price of dispatch. Tiberius, however, in a letter to the Senate, argued that it was the usage of our ancestors, when they would renounce friendship, to forbid the person obnoxious their house, and by it shut up all intercourse, a usage repeated by himself towards Labeo, whereas Labeo, who was charged with maladministration and other crimes, had now, by leaving upon the prince the odium of his death, sought a veil to his own guilt, and thence falsely terrified his wife, to whom, however criminal, no punishment was meant. Mamercus Scaurus was thereafter questioned afresh, a man of signal quality, a noble orator, but profligate liver. In his overthrow, the friendship of Sejanus had no share, but an engine no less potent to destroy, the enmity of Macro, who pursued, but with more subtlety, the same depraved politics. He was furnished with a handle from a tragedy composed by Scaurus, in which were some lines capable of being pointed against Tiberius. But the accusers, Servilius and Cornelius, the crimes objected were those of adultery with Livia and the mysteries of magic. Scaurus, as became the magnanimity of the ancient Emili, prevented condemnation by the persuasion of Sextia his wife, who animated him to die, and died with him. And yet the accusers, when opportunity occurred, were surrendered to vengeance, as were this same Servilius and Cornelius, men become famous by the doom of Scaurus. But for accepting from Varius Ligor a bribe to drop prosecution, they were interdicted fire and water, and exiled into different lands. Abudius Rufo, too, once aedile, whilst he brought a charge against Lentulus Getulicus, under whom he had led a legion, that he had espoused his daughter to marry a son of Sejanus, was himself condemned and banished Rome. Getulicus was at this time commander of the legions in Upper Germany, and by them wonderfully beloved, for his unbounded clemency and his discipline void of rigour. Neither was he unacceptable to the neighbouring army, through his interest in Lucius Apronius, his father-in-law. Hence he was universally believed to have, by a letter, represented to the emperor that by no choice of his own had he joined affinity with Sejanus, but in compliance with the counsel of Tiberius, and was as liable as Tiberius to be deceived. Nor ought one and the same error to pass unblamed in the prince only, and upon all others draw down deadly vengeance. For his own faith it was pure and inviolate, and if against him no plots were framed, would continue unshaken. A successor he would receive as no other than the herald of death. It remained therefore that between them two they should, as it were, establish a league, by which the prince should still enjoy all the rest of the empire, and he himself always retain his province. This proceeding, however amazing, derived credit from hence, that he only of all that were allied to Sejanus remained in safety, and even in high favour. Tiberius, indeed, considered himself under the pressure of public hatred, under the weight of extreme age, and that more by reputation than force his authority was upheld. End of Book 6, Part 2. Recording by Kalinda in Raymond, New Hampshire, on February 20th, 2008.
Book 6, Part 3 of the Annals, by Publius Cornelius Tacitus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Coleman. The Annals, by Publius Cornelius Tacitus. Translated by Alfred John Church and William Jackson Brodribb. Book 6, AD 32 to 37, Part 3, Administrative Settlements in the East. In the consulship of Caius Cestius and Marcus Servilius, some Parthian nobles came to Rome without the knowledge of their king Artabanus. Dread of Germanicus had made that prince faithful to the Romans and just to his people, but he subsequently changed this behaviour for insolence towards us and tyranny to his subjects. He was elated by the wars which he had successfully waged against the surrounding nations, while he disdained the aged and, as he thought, unwarlike Tiberius, eagerly coveting Armenia, over which, on the death of Artaxias, he placed Arsaces, his eldest son. He further added insult and sent envoys to reclaim the treasures left by Vonones in Syria and Cilicia. Then too he insisted on the ancient boundaries of Persia and Macedonia, and intimated, with a vainglorious threat, that he meant to seize on the country possessed by Cyrus, and afterwards by Alexander. The chief adviser of the Parthians in sending the secret embassy was Sinarches, a man of distinguished family and corresponding wealth. Next in influence was Abdus, an eunuch, a class which, far from being despised among barbarians, actually possesses power. These, with some other nobles whom they admitted to their councils, as there was not a single Arsacid whom they could put on the throne, most of the family having been murdered by Artabanus, or being under age, demanded that Phraates, son of King Phraates, should be sent from Rome. Only a name, they said, and on authority were wanted. Only in fact, that with Caesar's consent, a scion of the house of Arsaces should show himself on the banks of the Euphrates. This suited the wishes of Tiberius. He provided Phraates with what he needed for assuming his father's sovereignty, while he clung to his purpose of regulating foreign affairs by a crafty policy, and keeping war at a distance. Artabanus, meanwhile, hearing of the treacherous arrangement, was one moment perplexed by apprehension, the next fired with a longing for revenge. With barbarians, indecision is a slave's weakness, prompt action king-like. But now expediency prevailed, and he invited Abdus, under the guise of friendship, to a banquet, and disabled him by a lingering poison. Sinarches he put off by pretexts and presents, and also by various employments. Phraates, meanwhile, on arriving in Syria, where he threw off the Roman fashions to which for so many years he had been accustomed, and adapted himself to Parthian habits, unable to endure the customs of his country, was carried off by an illness. Still, Tiberius did not relinquish his purpose. He chose Tiridates, of the same stock as Artabanus, to be his rival, and the Iberian Mithridates to be the instrument of recovering Armenia, having reconciled him to his brother Pharasmanes, who held the throne of that country. He then entrusted the whole of his eastern policy to Lucius Vitellius. The man, I am aware, had a bad name at Rome, and many a foul story was told of him. But in the government of provinces he acted with the virtue of ancient times. He returned, and then, through fear of Caius Caesar and intimacy with Claudius, he degenerated into a servility so base that he is regarded by an after generation as the type of the most degrading adulation. The beginning of his career was forgotten in its end, and an old age of infamy effaced the virtues of youth. Of the petty chiefs, Mithridates was the first to persuade Pharasmanes to aid his enterprise by stratagem and force, and agents of corruption were found who tempted the servants of Arsaces into crime by a quantity of gold. At the same instant the Iberians burst into Armenia with a huge host, and captured the city of Artaxata. Artabanus, on hearing this, made his son Orodes the instrument of vengeance. He gave him the Parthian army, and dispatched men to hire auxiliaries. Pharasmanes, on the other hand, allied himself with the Albanians, and procured aid from the Sarmatae, whose highest chiefs took bribes from both sides, after the fashion of their countrymen, and engaged themselves in conflicting interests. But the Iberians, who were masters of the various positions, suddenly poured the Sarmatae into Armenia by the Caspian route. Meanwhile, those who were coming up to the support of the Parthians were easily kept back, all other approaches having been closed by the enemy except one, between the sea and the mountains on the Albanian frontier, which summer rendered difficult, as there the shallows are flooded by the force of the Etesian gales. The south wind in winter rolls back the waves, and when the sea is driven back upon itself, the shallows along the coast are exposed. Meantime, while Orodes was without an ally, Pharasmanes, now strengthened by reinforcements, challenged him to battle, taunted him on his refusal, rode up to his camp and harassed his foraging parties. He often hemmed him in with his piquets in the fashion of a blockade, till the Parthians, who were unused to such insults, gathered round the king and demanded battle. Their sole strength was in cavalry. Pharasmanes was also powerful in infantry, for the Iberians and Albanians, inhabiting as they did a densely wooded country, were more inured to hardship and endurance. They claimed to have been descended from the Thessalians, at the period when Jason, after the departure of Media, and the children born of her, returned subsequently to the empty palace of Aeetes, and the vacant kingdom of Colchi. They have many traditions connected with his name and with the oracle of Phrixus. No one among them would think of sacrificing a ram, the animal supposed to have conveyed Phrixus, whether it was really a ram or the figurehead of a ship. Both sides having been drawn up in battle array, the Parthian leader expatiated on the empire of the East, and the renown of the Arsacids, in contrast to the despicable Iberian chief with his hireling soldiery. Pharasmanes reminded his people that they had been free from Parthian domination, and that the grander their aims, the more glory they would win if victorious, the more disgrace and peril they would incur if they turned their backs. He pointed, as he spoke, to his own menacing array, and to the Median bands with their golden embroidery. Warriors, as he said, on one side, spoil on the other. Among the Sarmatae, the general's voice was not alone to be heard. They encouraged one another not to begin the battle with volleys of arrows. They must, they said, anticipate attack by a hand-to-hand charge. Then followed every variety of conflict. The Parthians, accustomed to pursue or fly with equal science, deployed their squadrons and sought scope for their missiles. The Sarmatae, throwing aside their bows, which at a shorter range are effective, rushed on with pikes and swords. Sometimes, as in a cavalry action, there would be alternate advances and retreats, then again close fighting, in which breast to breast, with the clash of arms, they repulsed the foe, or were themselves repulsed. And now the Albanians and Iberians seized, and hurled the Parthians from their steeds, and embarrassed their enemy with a double attack, pressed as they were by the cavalry on the heights, and by the nearer blows of the infantry. Meanwhile, Pharasmanes and Orodes, who as they cheered on the brave and supported the wavering, were conspicuous to all, and so recognized each other, rushed to the combat with a shout, with javelins and galloping chargers, Pharasmanes with a greater impetuosity, for he pierced his enemy's helmet at a stroke. But he could not repeat the blow, as he was hurried onwards by his horse, and the wounded man was protected by the bravest of his guards. A rumour that he was slain, which was believed by mistake, struck panic into the Parthians, and they yielded the victory. Artabanus very soon marched with the whole strength of his kingdom, intent on vengeance. The Iberians, from their knowledge of the country, fought at an advantage. Still Artabanus did not retreat till Vitellius had assembled his legions, and, by starting a report that he meant to invade Mesopotamia, raised an alarm of war with Rome. Armenia was then abandoned, and the fortunes of Artabanus were overthrown, Vitellius persuading his subjects to forsake a king who was a tyrant in peace and ruinously unsuccessful in war. And so Sinnaces, whose enmity to the prince I have already mentioned, drew into actual revolt his father Abdageses and others, who had been secretly in his council, and were now, after their continued disasters, more eager to fight. By degrees, many flocked to him who, having been kept in subjection by fear rather than by good will, took courage as soon as they found leaders. Artabanus had now no resources but in some foreigners who guarded his person, men exiled from their own homes, who had no perception of honour or any scruple about a base act, mere hireling instruments of crime. With these attendants he hastened his flight into the remote country on the borders of Scythia, in the hope of aid, as he was connected by marriage alliances with the Hyrcanians and Carmanians. Meantime the Parthians, he thought, indulgent as they are to an absent prince, though restless under his presence, might turn to a better mind. Vitellius, as soon as Artabanus had fled and his people were inclined to have a new king, urged Tiridates to seize the advantage thus offered, and then led the main strength of the legions and the allies to the banks of the Euphrates. While they were sacrificing, the one, after Roman custom, offering a swine, a ram, and a bull, the other a horse, which he had duly prepared as a propitiation to the river god, they were informed by the neighbouring inhabitants that the Euphrates, without any violent rains, was of itself rising to an immense height, and that the white foam was curling into circles like a diadem, an omen of a prosperous passage. Some explained it with more subtlety, of a successful commencement to the enterprise, which, however, would not be lasting, on the ground that though a confident trust might be placed in prognostics given in the earth or in the heavens, the fluctuating character of rivers exhibited omens which vanished the same moment. A bridge of boats having been constructed, and the army having crossed, the first to enter the camp was Ornaspades, with several thousand cavalry. Formerly an exile, he had rendered conspicuous aid to Tiberius in the completion of the Dalmatic War, and had for this been rewarded with Roman citizenship. Subsequently he had again sought the friendship of his king, by whom he had been raised to high honour, and appointed governor of the plains, which, being surrounded by the waters of those famous rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris, have received the name of Mesopotamia. Soon afterwards Sinnaces reinforced the army, and Abdageses, the mainstay of the party, came with the royal treasure and what belonged to the crown. Vitellius thought it enough to have displayed the arms of Rome, and he then bade Tiridates remember his grandfather Phraates and his foster father Caesar, and all that was glorious in both of them, while the nobles were to show obedience to their king and respect for us, each maintaining his honour and his loyalty. This done, he returned with the legions to Syria. I have related in sequence the events of 2 summer campaigns, as a relief to the reader's mind from our miseries at home. Though 3 years had elapsed since the destruction of Sejanus, neither time, entreaties, nor sated gratification, all which have a soothing effect on others, softened Tiberius, or kept him from punishing doubtful or forgotten offences as most flagrant and recent crimes. Under this dread, Fulcinius Trio, unwilling to face an onslaught of accusers, inserted in his will several terrible imputations on Macro, and on the emperor's principal freedmen, while he taunted the emperor himself with the mental decay of old age, and the virtual exile of continuous retirement. Tiberius ordered these insults, which Trio's heirs had suppressed, to be publicly read, thus showing his tolerance of free speech in others, and despising his own shame, or possibly because he had long been ignorant of the villainies of Sejanus, and now wished any remarks, however reckless, to be published, and so to ascertain, through invective, if it must be so, the truth which flattery obscures. About the same time Granius Marcianus, a senator, who was accused of treason by Caius Gracchus, laid hands on himself. Tarius Gratianus, too, an ex-praetor, was condemned under the same law to capital punishment. A similar fate befell Trebellianus Rufus and Sextius Peconianus. Trebellianus perished by his own hand. Peconianus was strangled in prison for having there written some lampoons on the emperor. Tiberius received the news, no longer parted by the sea, as he had been once, or through messengers from a distance, but in close proximity to Rome, so that on the same day, or after the interval of a single night, he could reply to the despatches of the consuls, and almost behold the bloodshed as it streamed from house to house, and the strokes of the executioner. At the year's close, Poppaeus Sabinus died, a man of somewhat humble extraction, who had risen by his friendship with 2 emperors to the consulship and the honours of a triumph. During 24 years he had the charge of the most important provinces, not for any remarkable ability, but because he was equal to business, and was not too great for it. Quintus Plautius and Sextus Papinius were the next consuls. The fact that that year Lucius Arusius was put to death did not strike men as anything horrible, from their familiarity with evil deeds. But there was a panic when Vibulanus Agrippa, a Roman knight, as soon as his accusers had finished their case, took from his robe, in the very Senate house, a dose of poison, drank it off, and, as he fell expiring, was hurried away to prison by the prompt hands of lictors, where the neck of the now lifeless man was crushed with a halter. Even Tigranes, who had once ruled Armenia and was now impeached, did not escape the punishment of an ordinary citizen on the strength of his royal title. Caius Galba, meanwhile, and the Blaisi perished by a voluntary death. Galba because a harsh letter from the emperor forbade him to have a province allotted to him, while as for the Blaisi, the priesthoods intended for them during the prosperity of their house, Tiberius had withheld, when that prosperity was shaken, and now conferred, as vacant offices, on others. This they understood as a signal of their doom, and acted on it. Aemilia Lepida, too, whose marriage with the younger Drusus I have already related, who, though she had pursued her husband with ceaseless accusations, remained unpunished, infamous as she was, as long as her father Lepidus lived, subsequently fell a victim to the informers for adultery with a slave. There was no question about her guilt, and so, without an attempt at defence, she put an end to her life. At this same time the Clitae, a tribe subject to the Cappadocian Archelaus, retreated to the heights of Mount Taurus, because they were compelled in Roman fashion to render an account of their revenue, and submit to tribute. There they defended themselves by means of the nature of the country against the king's unwarlike troops, till Marcus Trebellius, whom Vitellius, the governor of Syria, sent as his lieutenant with 4,000 legionaries and some picked auxiliaries, surrounded with his lines 2 hills occupied by the barbarians, the lesser of which was named Cadra, the other Devara. Those who dared to sally out he reduced to surrender by the sword, the rest by drought. Tiridates, meanwhile, with the consent of the Parthians, received the submission of Nicephorium, Anthemusius, and the other cities, which, having been founded by Macedonians, claim Greek names, also of the Parthian towns, Helios and Artemita. There was a rivalry of joy among the inhabitants who detested Artabanus, bred as he had been among the Scythians, for his cruelty, and hoped to find in Tiridates a kindly spirit from his Roman training. Seleucia, a powerful and fortified city, which had never lapsed into barbarism, but had clung loyally to its founder Seleucus, assumed the most marked tone of flattery. 300 citizens, chosen for wealth or wisdom, form a kind of senate, and the people have powers of their own. When both act in concert, they look with contempt on the Parthians. As soon as they are at discord, and the respective leaders invite aid for themselves against their rivals, the ally summoned to help a faction crushes them all. This had lately happened in the reign of Artabanus, who for his own interest put the people at the mercy of the nobles. As a fact, popular government almost amounts to freedom, while the rule of the few approaches closely to a monarch's caprice. Seleucia now celebrated the arrival of Tiridates with all the honours paid to princes of old, and all which modern times, with a more copious inventiveness, have devised. Reproaches were at the same time heaped on Artabanus, as an Arsacid indeed on his mother's side, but as in all else degenerate. Tiridates gave the government of Seleucia to the people. Soon afterwards, as he was deliberating on what day he should inaugurate his reign, he received letters from Phraates and Hiero, who held two very powerful provinces, imploring a brief delay. It was thought best to wait for men of such commanding influence, and meanwhile Ctesiphon, the seat of empire, was their chosen destination. But as they postponed their coming from day to day, the Serena, in the presence of an approving throng, crowned Tiridates, according to the national usage, with the royal diadem. And now had he instantly made his way to the heart of the country, and to its other tribes, the reluctance of those who wavered would have been overpowered, and all to a man would have yielded. By besieging a fortress into which Artabanus had conveyed his treasure and his concubines, he gave them time to disown their compact. Phraates and Hiero, with others who had not united in celebrating the day fixed for the coronation, some from fear, some out of jealousy of Abdageses, who then ruled the court and the new king, transferred their allegiance to Artabanus. They found him in Hyrcania, covered with filth, and procuring sustenance with his bow. He was at first alarmed under the impression that treachery was intended, but when they pledged their honour that they had come to restore to him his dominion, his spirit revived, and he asked what the sudden change meant. Hiero then spoke insultingly of the boyish years of Tiridates, hinting that the throne was not held by an Arsacid, but that a mere empty name was enjoyed by a feeble creature bred in foreign effeminacy, while the actual power was in the house of Abdageses. An experienced king, Artabanus knew that men do not necessarily feign hatred because they are false in friendship. He delayed only while he was raising auxiliaries in Scythia, and then pushed on in haste, thus anticipating the plots of enemies and the fickleness of friends. Wishing to attract popular sympathy, he did not even cast off his miserable garb. He stooped to wiles and to entreaties, to anything indeed, by which he might allure the wavering and confirm the willing. He was now approaching the neighbourhood of Seleucia with a large force, while Tiridates, dismayed by the rumour, and then by the king's presence in person, was divided in mind, and doubted whether he should march against him, or prolong the war by delay. Those who wished for battle with its prompt decision argued that ill-arrayed levies, fatigued by a long march, could not even in heart be thoroughly united in obedience, traitors and enemies as they had lately been, to the prince whom now again they were supporting. Abdageses, however, advised a retreat into Mesopotamia. There, with a river in their front, they might in the interval summon to their aid the Armenians and Elymenians, and other nations in their rear, and then, reinforced by allies and troops which would be sent by the Roman general, they might try the fortune of war. This advice prevailed, for Abdageses had the chief influence, and Tiridates was a coward in the face of danger. But their retreat resembled a flight. The Arabs made a beginning, and then the rest went to their homes or to the camp of Artabanus, till Tiridates returned to Syria with a few followers, and thus relieved all from the disgrace of desertion. That same year, Rome suffered from a terrible fire, and part of the circus near the Aventine hill was burnt, as well as the Aventine quarter itself. This calamity the emperor turned to his own glory by paying the values of the houses and blocks of tenements. 100 million of sesterces was expended in this munificence, a boon all the more acceptable to the populace, as Tiberius was rather sparing in building at his private expense. He raised only 2 structures, even at the public cost, the Temple of Augustus and the stage of Pompey's theatre. And when these were completed, he did not dedicate them, either out of contempt for popularity or from his extreme age. 4 commissioners, all husbands of the emperor's granddaughters, Gnaeus Domitius, Cassius Longinus, Marcus Vinicius, Rubellius Blandus, were appointed to assess the damage in each case, and Publius Petronius was added to their number on the nomination of the consuls. Various honours were devised and decreed to the emperor, such as each man's ingenuity suggested. It is a question which of these he rejected or accepted, as the end of his life was so near. For soon afterwards Tiberius's last consuls, Gnaeus Acerronius and Caius Pontius, entered on office, Macro's power being now excessive. Every day the man cultivated more assiduously than ever the favour of Caius Caesar, which indeed he had never neglected, and after the death of Claudia, who had, as I have related, been married to Caius, he had prompted his wife Ennia to inveigle the young prince by a pretence of love, and to bind him by an engagement of marriage, and the lad, provided he could secure the throne, shrank from no conditions. For though he was of an excitable temper, he had thoroughly learnt the falsehoods of hypocrisy under the loving care of his grandfather. This the emperor knew, and he therefore hesitated about bequeathing the empire first between his grandsons. Of these, the son of Drusus was nearest in blood and natural affection, but he was still in his childhood. Germanicus's son was in the vigour of youth and enjoyed the people's favour, a reason for having his grandfather's hatred. Tiberius had even thought of Claudius, as he was of sedate age and had a taste for liberal culture, but a weak intellect was against him. If, however, he were to seek a successor outside of his house, he feared that the memory of Augustus and the name of the Caesars would become a laughing-stock and a scorn. It was, in fact, not so much popularity in the present for which he cared, as for glory in the future. Perplexed in mind, exhausted in body, he soon left to destiny a question to which he was unequal, though he threw out some hints from which it might be inferred that he foresaw what was to come. He taunted Macro, in no obscure terms, with forsaking the setting and looking to the rising sun. Once too, when Caius Caesar, in a casual conversation, ridiculed Lucius Sulla, he predicted to him that he would have all Sulla's vices and none of his virtues. At the same moment he embraced the younger of his 2 grandsons with a flood of tears, and, noting the savage face of the other, said, "You will slay this boy, and will be yourself slain by another." But even while his strength was fast failing, he gave up none of his debaucheries. In his sufferings he would simulate health, and was wont to jest at the arts of the physician, and at all who, after the age of 30, require another man's advice to distinguish between what is beneficial or hurtful to their constitutions. At Rome, meanwhile, were being sown the seeds of bloodshed to come even after Tiberius's death. Acutia, formerly the wife of Publius Vitellius, had been accused of treason by Laelius Balbus. When, on her condemnation, a reward was being voted to her prosecutor, Junius Otho, tribune of the people, interposed his veto. Hence a feud between Vitellius and Otho, ending in Otho's banishment. Then Albucilla, notorious for the number of her lovers, who had been married to Satrius Secundus, the betrayer of the late conspiracy, was charged with irreverence towards the emperor. With her were involved as her accomplices and paramours Gnaeus Domitius, Vibius Marsus, and Lucius Arruntius. I have already spoken of the illustrious rank of Domitius. Marsus too was distinguished by the honours of his ancestors and by his own attainments. It was, however, stated in the notes of the proceedings furnished to the Senate, that Macro had superintended the examination of the witnesses and the torture of the slaves, and the fact that there was no letter from the emperor against the defendants caused a suspicion that, while he was very feeble and possibly ignorant of the matter, the charge was to a great extent invented to gratify Macro's well-known enmity against Arruntius. And so Domitius and Marsus prolonged their lives, Domitius preparing his defence, Marsus having apparently resolved on starvation. Arruntius, when his friends advised delay and temporizing, replied that the same conduct was not becoming in all persons. He had had enough of life, and all he regretted was that he had endured amid scorn and peril an old age of anxious fears, long detested by Sejanus, now by Macro, always indeed by some powerful minister, not for any fault, but as a man who could not tolerate gross iniquities. Granted the possibility of passing safely through the few last days of Tiberius, how was he to be secure under the youth of the coming sovereign? Was it probable that, when Tiberius, with his long experience of affairs, was, under the influence of absolute power, wholly perverted and changed, Caius Caesar, who had hardly completed his boyhood, was thoroughly ignorant and bred under the vilest training, would enter on a better course, with Macro for his guide, who, having been selected for his superior wickedness to crush Sejanus, had by yet more numerous crimes been the scourge of the state. He now foresaw a still more galling slavery, and therefore sought to flee alike from the past and from the impending future. While he thus spoke like a prophet, he opened his veins. What followed will be a proof that Arruntius rightly chose death. Albicilla, having stabbed herself with an ineffectual wound, was by the Senate's order carried off to prison. Those who had ministered to her profligacy, Carcidius Sacerdos, an ex-praetor, and Pontius Fregelanus, were sentenced, respectively, to transportation to an island and to loss of a senator's rank. A like punishment was adjudged in the case of Laelius Balbus, and indeed with intense satisfaction, as Balbus was noted for his savage eloquence and his eagerness to assail the innocent. About the same time, Sextus Papinius, who belonged to a family of consular rank, chose a sudden and shocking death by throwing himself from a height. The cause was ascribed to his mother, who, having been repeatedly repulsed in her overtures, had at last by her arts and seductions driven him to an extremity from which he could find no escape but death. She was accordingly put on her trial before the Senate, and, although she grovelled at the knees of the senators, and long urged a parent's grief, the greater weakness of a woman's mind under such an affliction, and other sad and pitiful pleas of the same painful kind, she was after all banished from Rome for 10 years, till her younger son would have passed the frail period of youth. Tiberius's bodily powers were now leaving him, but not his skill in dissembling. There was the same stern spirit. He had his words and looks under strict control, and occasionally would try to hide his weakness, evident as it was, by a forced politeness. After frequent changes of place, he at last settled down on the promontory of Misenum, in a country house once owned by Lucius Lucullus. There it was noted, in this way, that he was drawing near his end. There was a physician, distinguished in his profession, of the name of Charicles, usually employed, not indeed to have the direction of the emperor's varying health, but to put his advice at immediate disposal. This man, as if he were leaving on business his own, clasped his hand with a show of homage, and touched his pulse. Tiberius noticed it. Whether he was displeased and strove the more to hide his anger is a question. At any rate, he ordered the banquet to be renewed, and sat at the table longer than usual, by way, apparently, of showing honour to his departing friend. Charicles, however, assured Macro that his breath was failing, and that he would not last more than 2 days. All was at once hurry. There were conferences among those on the spot, and despatches to the generals and armies. On the 15th of March, his breath failing, he was believed to have expired, and Caius Caesar was going forth with a numerous throng of congratulating followers to take the first possession of the empire, when suddenly news came that Tiberius was recovering his voice and sight, and calling for persons to bring him food to revive him from his faintness. Then ensued a universal panic, and while the rest fled hither and thither, every one feigning grief or ignorance, Caius Caesar, in silent stupor, passed from the highest hopes to the extremity of apprehension. Macro, nothing daunted, ordered the old emperor to be smothered under a huge heap of clothes, and all to quit the entrance hall. And so died Tiberius, in the 78th year of his age. Nero was his father, and he was on both sides descended from the Claudian house, though his mother passed by adoption first into the Livian, then into the Julian family. From earliest infancy perilous vicissitudes were his lot. Himself an exile, he was the companion of a proscribed father, and on being admitted as a stepson into the house of Augustus, he had to struggle with many rivals, so long as Marcellus and Agrippa, and subsequently Caius and Lucius Caesar, were in their glory. Again his brother Drusus enjoyed in a greater degree the affection of the citizens. But he was more than ever on dangerous ground after his marriage with Julia, whether he tolerated or escaped from his wife's profligacy. On his return from Rhodes, he ruled the emperor's now heirless house for 12 years, and the Roman world with absolute sway for about 23. His character, too, had its distinct periods. It was a bright time in his life and reputation, while under Augustus he was a private citizen, or held high offices; a time of reserve and crafty assumption of virtue, as long as Germanicus and Drusus were alive. Again, while his mother lived, he was a compound of good and evil. He was infamous for his cruelty, though he veiled his debaucheries, while he loved or feared Sejanus. Finally, he plunged into every wickedness and disgrace, when, fear and shame being cast off, he simply indulged his own inclinations. Note: the 4 following books and the beginning of Book 11, which are lost, contains the history of a period of nearly 10 years, from AD 37 to AD 47. These years included the reign of Caius Caesar, Caligula, the son of Germanicus by the elder Agrippina, and the first 6 years of the reign of Claudius. Caius Caesar's reign was 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days in duration. Claudius, Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus, the brother of Germanicus, succeeded him at the age of 50, and reigned from AD 41 to AD 54. The 11th book of the Annals opens with the 7th year of Claudius's reign. The power of his wife Messalina was then at its height. She was, it seems, jealous of a certain Poppaea Sabina, who is mentioned in Book 13 as having surpassed in beauty all the ladies of her day. This Poppaea was the daughter of the Poppaeus Sabinus alluded to in Book 6, and the mother of the more famous Poppaea, afterwards the wife of the Emperor Nero. Messalina contrived to involve this lady and her lover, Valerius Asiaticus, in a ruinous charge. Asiaticus had been twice consul, once under Caius Caesar, a second time under Claudius in AD 46. He was rich as well as noble. The 11th book, as we have it, begins with the account of his prosecution by means of Messalina, who, with the help of Lucius Vitellius, Vitellius father of the Vitellius afterwards emperor, effected his ruin. End of note. End of Book 6. Recording by Andrew Coleman.